Welcome to Savage Harry. Today's adventure. What if the Winter Soldier was activated by Harry's magic and adopted him as his final mission? If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The sleeper beneath Hampstead number 4, Privet Drive had a smell in the afternoons. It was the smell of cooked grease cooling in a pan, of carpet shampoo, of central heating set 3 degrees too warm for the day. Vernon Dursley had insisted on the heating. Petunia had insisted on the carpets. Dudley had insisted on cake, and Dudley, at the age of 4, very rarely failed to be obliged. Harry Potter, also 4, was crouched in the corner of the living room behind the leg of the armchair, trying to be small enough to count as part of the furniture. He had learned this trick early. He had learned a great many tricks early. He had learned that if he made himself flat against the wallpaper, Aunt Petunia's eyes would skim over him on their way to dust or photographs or her son's mouth. He had learned that if his cousin laughed in a particular pitch, it was useful to be somewhere else by the 3rd syllable. He had learned that the cupboard under the stairs, though dark, was the safest room in the house, because no one wanted to go there except him. Today he had failed at the 3rd trick. He had been in the living room because his aunt had set him to fetch Dudley's toy from beneath the armchair, and the toy had been a tin soldier with a chipped paint face. And Dudley, watching from the doorway, had not enjoyed the way Harry's small fingers closed around the toy first. Dudley had crossed the room with the deliberate movement of a child who had never been told number. He had taken hold of Harry's wrist. He had bent it backward. He had bent it backward further than a 4-year-old wrist was designed to bend, until something inside Harry's forearm announced itself with a sound that the carpet absorbed, but the bone did not. Harry did not scream. Screaming had never worked. Screaming, in fact, was the surest path to the cupboard with the door bolted from the outside and no supper. What Harry did was inhale. It was a small inhale, no more than half a breath, and then he held it, and then he did the thing he had never done before, which was want. He wanted, with the full and uncomplicated wanting of a small child in pain, for the hurt to stop. He wanted the hand that was holding him to let go. He wanted, with a precision that was almost adult in its directness, for everything that was bigger than him in the room to be smaller than him for 1 second. Just one. Just long enough for him to breathe. The pulse went out of him through the broken arm. It was not a sound. It was not light. The living room lamp did not flicker. The television did not hiss. The carpet shampoo continued to smell. The pulse was a soft and entirely silent rearrangement of the air, like the small displacement that happens when a door opens in a far room of a very large house. It traveled outward through the wallpaper and the brick and the lath and the plaster and the spongy autumn ground beneath Privet Drive. And it did not slow. It traveled through gas mains and Victorian sewer brick, through the foundations of a primary school, where the lights had been switched off an hour before, through the topsoil of a cricket green, where the rollers had been pushed back into a shed for the winter, through a kilometer of London clay so old that it remembered the river before there had been a city above it, and then a kilometer more. It threaded between tube tunnels in the negative space the engineers had left untouched for vibration tolerances. It crossed the river without disturbing the river. A bargeman on the Thames felt, for half a second, the small, clean sensation of a held note ending, and reached for his cigarettes without knowing why. The pulse reached Hampstead Heath in a little under 2 seconds. It slid beneath a rusted maintenance shed at the eastern edge of the heath, a shed that had stood there since the war and had been, on the Ordnance Survey maps that mattered to the people who used such maps, mislabeled twice. The pulse descended through the floor of the shed, descended through the false floor beneath the floor, descended through 3 further floors that were not on any maps at all, and arrived at last, very softly, against the beveled glass of a cryogenic capsule that had not been opened in 13 years. Inside the capsule, a frequency tripped. The capsule was unmarked. The room around it had been built by men who liked rooms without markings. There were no logos on the walls. There were no logos on the equipment. There was, in the corner, a single black metal plaque that had been bolted to a steel housing and read, in stenciled letters, WSP-17, dormant, do not wake. WSP-17 was waking. The frequency that had tripped was not on any catalog. It was not in any handler's voice file. It was a frequency that the technicians who built the capsule had never imagined, because they had built the capsule to listen for the sound of trigger words and the sound of recall protocols, and they had not built it to listen for the sound of a small child wanting a hand to let go of his wrist. They had not believed the sound existed. The lid hissed. Coolant vented in a long sigh that condensed against the cold ceiling and ran in beaded lines down the beveled glass. 6 tubes that had been delivering a careful chemical balance to a sleeping man for 13 years retracted in sequence from the ports they had been threaded into. The man inside the capsule, who had been suspended between sleep and storage, opened his eyes. He did not move at first. He let the eyes do their work. The eyes were brown, flecked, and the pupils took a moment to find the geometry of the room they were now in, because the room was new to them in the way all rooms were new after 13 years. They catalogued: ceiling, low, water-stained at the far corner. Lights, 2 bulbs, one dead, one a buttery yellow. Floor, poured concrete, sealed, sloped 1 degree toward a drain. Drain, small, brass, dust-rimmed. Walls, cinder block, painted that institutional pale that the building trade calls eggshell and that the men who painted such rooms called nothing. The first thing he did after the eyes was breathe. He did this slowly because his lungs had been doing very little work for a long time and a sudden breath would damage them. The second thing he did was take stock of himself. Left arm, metal fully responsive, hydraulic pressure nominal. Right arm, flesh, weak, requires conditioning. Spine aligned, vision returning, cognition intact though the recall framework was empty. He had no handler, he had no mission. He had only the bearing of the signal that had woken him, which had come from the southwest and which still resonated faintly against the inside of his skull, like a tuning fork that had been struck somewhere in another room. He sat up. He swung his legs over the lip of the capsule. The metal arm did not whine. It hummed very faintly as it had always hummed, with the cold, pleasant hum of a machine that was happy to be cold. He stood. He took a moment to be vertical. He flexed the metal arm. The plates along the forearm shifted against each other with the soft, scaled motion of something that had been engineered to move with the muscles it did not have. The shoulder rotation was full. The grip strength, when he tested it against the lip of the capsule, was not less than it had been the last time he had been awake. He looked around the room. 3 banks of equipment along the far wall were dead. The indicator panels showed the long failure pattern of installations that had been left to their own batteries until the batteries also gave up. A clipboard hung on a nail by the door. He looked at the clipboard. The top sheet was a checklist in Cyrillic, half of it ticked, the rest in handwriting that had stopped halfway through a sentence. The pen was still clipped to the board. Whoever had been writing had not finished. He filed this observation and moved on. He found the locker against the far wall, opened it with a touch the locker had been designed not to permit, and dressed himself in the clothes that had been folded inside 13 years before, against the day. They smelled of plastic and mothballs. The dark coat fit. The boots fit. He found in the inside pocket of the coat a roll of British banknotes, a set of forged identity documents under a name he did not remember, and a key to a bicycle lock that had probably rusted shut. He left the documents. He took the coat and the banknotes. He climbed the ladder to the false floor, climbed the next ladder to the real floor of the maintenance shed, and let himself out into the late afternoon over Hampstead Heath. The trees had begun to turn. He noted this without admiring it. He set his bearing, southwest, 23 kilometers plus or minus, and began to walk. He did not run. Running drew the eye. He walked the way a man walks who has somewhere to be but is not late for it, which was a posture he had not used in conscious memory, but which his body knew the way a body knows how to swim. He crossed the heath in the half-light. He took the tube part of the way because the tube was logical, and he was carrying nothing that made the metal arm announce itself through his sleeve. The passengers around him did not look at him because Londoners had been trained over many decades not to look at people on the tube. He got off at a station he did not know. He surfaced into a suburb of brick houses that all looked the same and were not the suburb he wanted, and walked the rest of the way. It took him 3.5 hours. He paused once at a newsagent on a corner he could not name, bought a packet of plain biscuits and a bottle of water, and ate one biscuit while standing in the doorway of a shut-up dry cleaner, because the flesh arm had begun to tremor, and his blood sugar wanted attention. The newsagent, a man in his 60s with hands marked by 20 years of stocking shelves, did not look at him twice. The bottle of water he drained in 3 swallows and put in a bin. The remaining biscuits went into the coat pocket. He kept walking. He passed a primary school in the long, thin shadow of late afternoon. 2 children, perhaps 6 years old, were running around the perimeter of the playground under the supervision of a teacher in a navy coat. He watched them for the space of 1 inhale. He did not know why he was watching them. He kept walking. By the time he was standing on the corner of Magnolia Crescent and Privet Drive, the sun was nearly down, and the street lamps had begun to come on one at a time the way street lamps do in places that have not had to think very hard about their street lamps. Somewhere a dog barked twice and stopped. A radio in a kitchen on the far side of the road played the closing music of an afternoon program. Privet Drive smelled, very faintly, of lawn mowers that had been put away too late in the season and of leaves that had not yet been swept. He observed the house for 41 minutes. He learned from observation that there were 3 adults in the house. No, one was a child, and so 2 adults and 2 children, that the kitchen window showed a woman at a sink, that the front room showed the silhouette of a heavy man in an armchair watching a television, that there were no dogs, that the back garden had a low fence, that the neighbor at number 2 was asleep in her chair and a cat was asleep in her lap, and that the boy he was here for was not visible through any window. He noted the absence of the boy. The signal still resonated. It was now stronger than it had been on the heath. The boy was inside. He mapped the approach. Front door, visible from 3 houses, 2 of which had lit windows facing the street. Side path between number 4 and number 6, gravel narrow, screened by a fence the height of a man's chest. Back garden gate, wooden, latched on the inside, easily reached over the top. He marked the back gate as the entry point. He marked the back door as the access door. He waited for a car to pass. It passed. He crossed Privet Drive at the unlit gap between 2 street lamps. He moved along the side path of number 6, because the neighbor at number 6 had pulled their curtains shut against the chill, and reached the back of the property without crossing any sightline that mattered. The garden was small and impeccably maintained. The grass had been cut within the week. The hedge had been clipped to a height that the woman of the house had decided, perhaps in consultation with no one, was the correct height for a hedge. There was a child's plastic slide in the corner, faded yellow, with a tricycle parked beside it that had not been ridden in some time. He noted the slide. He noted the tricycle. He noted the precise arrangement of the patio furniture, which suggested that the furniture was decorative rather than functional, which suggested that the garden was for show rather than for use, which suggested that the children of the house were not encouraged to be outside. He noted all of this in approximately 3 seconds and did not slow. He went over the back fence. He let himself in through the kitchen door, which had been locked, by the simple application of pressure to the latch. He stepped onto the linoleum without disturbing it. He walked into the front room. Vernon Dursley looked up from the television. There was a moment, perhaps a full second, in which Vernon's face arranged itself through the standard sequence of reactions a homeowner deploys when confronted by an intruder: confusion, indignation, a working up of bluster. The bluster did not arrive. The man in the dark coat did not give it time. He crossed the room in 3 strides, took Vernon's chin in the metal hand the way one might take a doorknob, and turned the chin up and to the left. The neck did what necks do when they are turned up and to the left by metal at sufficient speed. The television continued to play. The remote control fell from Vernon's hand and bounced softly on the carpet without changing the channel. The woman at the sink turned, because the television had not gone louder and the chair had creaked. He met her in the kitchen doorway. She had time to open her mouth. She did not have time to use it. The metal hand closed once at the base of her throat, briefly, and with the particular economy of a man who had been taught to do this thing thousands of times and who had never once been allowed to enjoy it. She slid down the doorframe. He laid her on the linoleum so that her head did not strike the corner of the cabinet, because he had been trained to be tidy. He stood in the kitchen and listened. There was a small wet sound from the floor that he did not regard. There was the television still talking about the football. There was, upstairs, the breathing of a child. He noted the breathing, identified it as the sleep breathing of a child a kilogram or 2 overweight, and dismissed it. The child upstairs was not the signal. The signal was below him. He turned his head very slowly and looked at the staircase. There was a cupboard beneath the staircase. The cupboard had a small grill at the bottom, and inside the grill there was a faint motion of small breaths, and behind the small breaths there was the resonance that had woken him in Hampstead 3.5 hours ago. He was looking at it now. He could feel it against the inside of his skull, the way you feel sunlight even with your eyes closed. He crossed to the cupboard. There was a bolt at the top of the door, set high enough that no 4-year-old could reach it. He drew the bolt. He opened the door. A small boy was sitting on a thin mattress in the cupboard. He was holding his left arm with his right hand very carefully, because his left arm was bent at a place arms were not designed to bend. He was not crying. He was looking up at the man in the dark coat, with the kind of steady, evaluative attention that small children sometimes have when they have not yet learned that adults are supposed to be looked away from. The soldier looked back at him. He was supposed to be measuring the asset for transport. He was supposed to be categorizing it for the handler who was not there. He was supposed to be making 1,000 small assessments about weight and compliance and the optimal route to extraction. He was making, instead, a single assessment that the framework in his head did not have a slot for. The framework said, identify the source of the signal, suppress the source. The framework had been built by men who had assumed that the source of any signal that woke an asset would be a hostile and adult source. The source had a broken arm and was approximately the height of his hip. The framework collapsed gently and rebuilt itself, in the small hot moment in which he stood there, into something else. The new framework had only one line of code. It said, protect the asset. Hello, the small boy said. The voice was scratchy from disuse. It had the careful diction of a child who had been told many times that he was loud, and who had learned by 4 to speak as though apologizing for taking up the air. The soldier looked at him a moment longer. Malinki, he said, in a Russian softer than the rest of him. It was not a word he had chosen. It had been very near the surface of the language his head had been speaking when it slept, and it meant little one, and it came out before the framework had finished rebuilding. He registered the slip with mild interest and did not correct it. He knelt. The metal arm was at the boy's eye level. The boy looked at the arm with a steady evaluative gaze and reached out, very slowly with his unbroken hand, and touched it. The metal was cold. The boy smiled. The soldier registered the smile, classified it as non-hostile, and made a decision that he would not understand for several years was a decision. He held out his flesh hand, palm up. The boy considered the hand. The boy put his own small, unbroken hand into it. "Your arm is broken," the soldier said. The English was clipped, the consonants overpronounced, the rhythm Russian. "I will set it. It will hurt for 9 seconds, then it will hurt less." "Okay," said the boy. The soldier set the arm. The boy's eyes filled, but he did not cry. The soldier noted the not crying with the same neutral attention he had given the smile and added it to the small folder he was beginning to build inside his head, the folder which had a single label written across it in the language his head was using, and which said simply, "Asset." The cupboard was small. He fitted into it sideways. He took off the dark coat and wrapped the boy in it. He picked the boy up with the flesh arm because the metal arm was for other purposes and stepped over the body in the kitchen doorway on his way to the back garden. He did not look at the body. He did not look at the chair in the front room. The other child was still asleep upstairs. The framework had nothing to say about the other child. He left. He went over the back fence the way he had come. He carried the boy through the suburb, and the suburb did not see him, because suburbs of brick houses that all look the same have a way of not seeing what passes between their hedgerows after dark. He found a car. The car opened itself for him. The car started itself for him. He laid the boy along the back seat with the coat tucked around him, and he drove south. He drove for a long time. He took back roads. He stopped twice, once to check that the boy was still breathing, once to swap the car for another car at a rural pub car park, because the first car had been reported missing 38 minutes after he took it and he had heard the police band on the radio. The boy slept through the swap. The boy slept through Kent. The boy woke briefly at the channel and looked out the window at the water and went back to sleep. The soldier did not sleep. He drove with the flesh hand on the wheel and the metal hand resting easy on the gear lever, and at every junction he ran through the options the way a man runs his fingers along a rosary, with the same mechanical reassurance. Where there were people who would be looking for the boy, he was not. Where there were people who might be looking for him, he avoided. He stayed off motorways. He stopped at petrol stations in the kind of small town that did not run CCTV and paid in coins. He talked to no one. Once a lorry driver outside a service station at 3 in the morning asked him for a light. He held out the lighter without speaking. The driver took the flame and nodded thanks and walked off without noting the metal fingers, because metal fingers in a dark coat at 3 in the morning did not register at service stations of that kind. By dawn they were in France. The soldier stopped at a roadside cafe outside Calais, where the proprietor spoke no English and asked no questions, and he bought a small carton of milk and a brioche, and he carried the milk and the brioche back to the car and woke the boy gently and watched the boy eat them. The boy did not speak. The boy had not yet decided whether the man was a thing to speak to. The soldier did not push. By the evening of the next day they were in Belgium. They slept 4 hours in a small motel outside Liège, the boy on the bed and the soldier in the chair against the door. The soldier did not sleep. He watched the door. He watched the boy. The boy slept the way exhausted children sleep, which is with the abandon of a creature that has finally found a place where no one will pull it off the mattress, and the soldier observed this and made a small adjustment to his planning that meant they would spend 2 extra nights in Belgium rather than 1 before moving on. By the 3rd day they were on a small private aircraft that had been provided to him, 20 years before, by a man whose name he no longer knew but whose access codes had outlived their owner. The pilot was an old Czech who looked at the soldier and the boy and decided, with the wisdom of a man who had flown several thousand passengers, he had not to ask about these two. The boy looked out the small oval window for the first hour with the kind of solemn attention that children give to miracles, and then fell asleep with his cheek against the glass. The soldier draped his dark coat over the boy's small shoulders and sat very still in the seat beside him for the remainder of the flight, and the pilot, glancing back twice through the cockpit door, observed the metal hand resting on the armrest near the small sleeping head, and decided, with the same wisdom, not to ask about the arm either. By the fourth day, they were in a snow-dusted apartment on the third floor of a building in Prague that overlooked a courtyard with a frozen fountain. The apartment had been a safe house since 1968. It had a kitchen that worked, a bed, a couch, 2 chairs, a great many books in 3 languages, a wardrobe in which the soldier hung the dark coat, a small cast-iron stove that took coal, and a window in the kitchen that opened on a narrow internal courtyard with a frozen fountain and a 30-foot drop. There were 3 exits, front door, fire escape, and a hatch in the bathroom ceiling that gave on the roof. He checked all 3 within 4 minutes of arriving. He returned to the living room. He set the boy on the couch and pulled a blanket up to his chin. The boy looked at the snow on the windows. The snow was the first the boy had ever seen. "Where are we?" the boy said. "Prague," said the soldier. "Prague," said the boy, testing the word. The soldier filled a kettle. He set it on the stove. He found in a tin in the cupboard above the stove a brick of tea so old that it had probably been put there by him. In a previous version of himself he did not remember. He boiled water. He poured tea. He gave a cup to the boy and watched the boy drink it. "What is your name?" he said. "Harry," said the boy. "Harry Potter." The soldier rolled the word around in his head. He filed it under the label that had previously said asset, and the label adjusted itself fractionally to make room for the name. "Harry," he said. "What's yours?" said Harry. The soldier did not know. The soldier had not known for 40 years. The soldier opened his mouth to say what he had said the last few times someone had asked, which was asset 17, and which was not on examination an answer that he wished to give to a 4-year-old in a borrowed coat in a snow-lit apartment in Prague. He thought about it. "James," he said after a moment. The name had been near the surface, like mailing key had been near the surface. It had been waiting. "My name is James." "James," said Harry. "Hello, James." "Hello, Harry," said James, who would be by the end of the year more like the man who had once been called Bucky than he had been at any point since 1944, and who did not yet know it and would not for some time. Harry finished the tea. James took the cup back from him, washed it carefully in the sink, set it on the rack and turned off the lamp. The snow continued to fall outside the window of the third-floor apartment that overlooked the courtyard with the frozen fountain, and the boy on the couch slept, and the man in the kitchen stood for a long while in the dark with his metal hand resting on the back of a wooden chair, listening to a child breathe in a way that, somewhere very deep in him, had always been the sound he had been built to hear, even though no one, including himself, had ever told him so. In the morning the boy woke before the man did. This was less because the boy was an early riser than because the man, for the first time in 13 years, was asleep with the part of himself that dreams, and the dreams had a great deal to catch up on. The boy padded into the kitchen in his bare feet. He found the man sitting upright in the wooden chair by the stove, head tipped slightly forward, the metal arm laid across his lap, and the flesh arm curled at his side. The boy stood for a moment looking at him. He looked at the metal arm. He looked at the man's face, which was the face of a man who had not, in the boy's experience, ever existed. An adult who slept in a chair within reach of a child instead of behind a locked door. The boy was hungry. The boy did not say so. The boy sat down on the floor by the stove and waited. The man woke 20 minutes later. He woke the way an adult wakes when there is a child in the room, that is, all at once with the eyes open before the body has moved. He looked at the boy on the floor. "How long?" he said. "A bit," said the boy. "Why did you not wake me?" The boy considered this. The boy did not know the answer in words, but he knew it in the part of him that had spent 4 years learning never to wake adults, because adults woken were adults who hit, and adults who hit harder when they were tired. The man, watching his face, appeared to understand. He nodded once. He stood up. He put a kettle on. He found, in a cupboard he had not yet checked, a tin of porridge oats that had not yet expired and a small jar of honey that had crystallized but was still good. He cooked the porridge with the careful, unhurried movements of a man who had not cooked porridge in a long time but who remembered how. He set the bowl on the small kitchen table. He pulled out a chair for the boy. He sat opposite. The boy ate. The man drank his tea and watched the boy eat and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. The metal arm rested on the table. The boy, between spoonfuls, reached out very tentatively with his small, undamaged hand and touched the metal arm again, the way he had touched it in the cupboard. The metal arm did not move. The boy stroked it once, the way a child strokes the head of a friendly dog, and went back to his porridge. The man said, in a voice he did not quite recognize as his own, "It is cold, always." Said the boy around a spoonful. "Does that bother you?" The boy thought about it. The boy shook his head. "Number cold's all right," he said. "Cupboards were cold." The man set down his tea. He set it down very carefully, the way one sets down a thing one does not wish to break. He looked at the boy across the table. He did not say anything. The boy, after a moment, looked up and saw the man's face and was, for a small and confusing instant, not entirely sure why the man's face looked the way it did. The man was not angry. The man was something else. The boy did not have the word. The man said after a long pause, "There will be no more cupboards." "Okay," said the boy. The man nodded once. He picked up the tea. He drank. Outside the window the snow was thickening against the panes. In the courtyard below, a man in a blue coat was shoveling the path around the frozen fountain. Somewhere in the building, a radio was playing, very faintly, the morning news in Czech. The boy finished the porridge and set down the spoon and pushed the bowl, with the careful courtesy of a child who had been hit for not pushing the bowl, into the middle of the table. "What do we do now?" said the boy. The man considered the question. The framework in his head, which had once been a thing of recall protocols and trigger words and operational planning, was rebuilding itself in real time, and the question, asked by a 4-year-old at a kitchen table in Prague, was one he had never been asked before in this configuration. He thought about it. He arrived at an answer that surprised him by its simplicity, and he gave it. "Now," said the man, "I teach you to be hard to kill." "Okay," said the boy, "and I teach you to be kind to small animals. These are both important." "Okay," said the boy, "and we will read books." "I can't read books," said the boy apologetically. "Then I will teach you to read them." The boy nodded as though this had settled something significant. He climbed down from the chair. He took the empty bowl off the table without being told and carried it to the sink. He could not reach the tap. The man got up and lifted the bowl from the boy's hands and washed it himself. And as he washed it, he said, in Russian first and then in English, the word "malenki," and then he said "little one," and the boy nodded once at each word as though he were filing them away in a folder of his own. That afternoon the man took the boy out into the city. He had put the boy in a small wool coat he had found at the back of the wardrobe, sized for a child who had grown up and gone away long since, and a pair of boots that were 2 sizes too big and into which the boy stepped without complaint. They walked along the cobbled street outside the apartment building. The snow was thin underfoot. The boy held the man's flesh hand. The man, who had been awake in a city for the first time in 13 years, was relearning the trick of being among people, and the trick was simpler than he remembered. People did not look at him. People did not look at anyone in this part of Prague because looking at people in this part of Prague had been, for a long time, a way of inviting questions one would rather not answer. They walked past a bakery. The boy slowed down. The man stopped. The boy did not ask for anything. The boy had learned in 4 years of life that asking was a thing that other children did. The man looked down at the boy. The man looked at the bakery window. The man stepped into the shop and came out 2 minutes later with a paper bag containing 2 pastries, one filled with sweet cheese, one with cherry preserves. He handed both to the boy and watched the boy try, with a 4-year-old's serious diligence, to eat them both at once. And the man's mouth did a thing it had not done in living memory, which was to bend at the corners in the direction of upward. The boy, who was watching the metal arm rather than the man's face, did not see it. The man did not mind. He did not need a witness. The thing that had happened at the corner of his mouth was a thing he had not needed to know had happened. The body had simply done it, and the body had filed it, and the body would do it again. They walked. The boy ate. The snow continued to fall. A woman pushing a perambulator nodded to them as they passed. The man returned the nod. The boy waved with the sticky hand that had been holding the second pastry. The woman smiled. They walked on. When the boy was tired, the man picked him up and carried him the rest of the way back to the apartment. The boy fell asleep against the shoulder that was not the metal one, and the man, climbing the 3 flights of stairs with the cold, easy movement of a body that did not register a sleeping child as weight, was thinking about the list inside his head. The list was very long now. The list included the names of 3 further safe houses he would have to verify by season's end, 2 passports he would have to forge, a set of identity documents for the boy, the gradual introduction of a Glock to small hands, the gradual introduction of a knife, the gradual introduction of Russian, and somewhere not at the bottom but in the middle, in the same handwriting as before, the words "teach him to laugh." He laid the boy on the couch. He covered him with the blanket. He stood for a long time in the kitchen with the metal hand resting on the back of the chair, and he watched the boy sleep, and the part of him that had been built to be a weapon was, for the first time in any version of his memory, doing what it had been built for, which turned out against all expectations not to be killing. Outside the window in the courtyard, the man in the blue coat finished shoveling. He went indoors. The snow filled in the paths he had cleared within the hour, and by morning there was no sign that any path had been cleared at all. Only the round, white shape of the frozen fountain in the middle of the white courtyard, and somewhere above it, in a 3rd-floor apartment, the steady sound of a child breathing and a man who had decided, without knowing he had decided it, that the rest of his life had a single line of code in it, and that line of code was a small boy with a broken arm and a quiet voice who had said hello to him in a cupboard. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. A Boyhood in Safe Houses. The first safe house was Prague, which Harry would later remember in fragments. The cast-iron stove in the kitchen, the smell of coal smoke off the courtyard, the cold square of light the window threw across the floor at 4 in the afternoon as the year turned toward winter. He was there from October until the following March. He learned in those 5 months to make a bed with the corners squared, to brush his teeth with a wooden-handled toothbrush, to count to 20 in English and to 30 in Russian, and to recognize the sound of a Skoda engine at the bottom of the street from the sound of any other engine, because the Skoda was a thing the man called James paid attention to. And Harry, who had decided in the first week that the man called James was the most interesting and trustworthy thing in the visible universe, paid attention to the things the man called James paid attention to. The second safe house was Riga. They went in a freight car along a route that the man called James had ridden in 1953, and had no reason to believe had changed. The freight car smelled of fish and timber. Harry slept in a hammock the man had strung between two bracing struts, and woke at the border crossings without being told, because the man had taught him, with the gentle insistence of a piano teacher running scales, to wake without sound when the train slowed. In Riga, they stayed in a narrow apartment over a music shop whose proprietor never raised her eyes from her counter and never asked a question. The shop sold sheet music and second-hand violins. Harry liked the violins. He was permitted to look at them but not to touch them because he was 4 going on 5, and his fingers were still sticky with the consequences of breakfast. The man on the third afternoon bought him a small wooden recorder. It had 4 holes and a single sweet note in its middle register that Harry, given a week, learned to find by ear. He played the note to the man one evening when the man had been quiet for an hour. The man listened. The man said, "That is a good note." Harry, who had never been told a thing he had made was good, learned in that sentence the difference between approval and praise. He chose, from then on, to pursue approval. He did not pursue praise. The man had not given him any, and Harry had decided, in the part of himself that was already older than his 5 years, that praise was a thing other adults did to children when they wanted the child to do a thing the adult had not yet asked for. By his 5th birthday, they were in the Carpathians. The man had a hut there that had been built by someone the man had once worked with, and which the someone had not survived to return to. It had a wood stove and a hand-pumped well and a wolf pelt nailed above the door, and the man, on the morning of Harry's 5th birthday, gave Harry a small folding knife with a wooden handle and showed him how to open and close it without cutting himself. Harry practiced for 2 hours. He cut himself once very lightly across the pad of his thumb. He did not cry. The man who had observed this from across the room did not praise the not crying. The man cleaned the cut, dressed it with a small square of gauze, and said, "Tomorrow we begin with the Makarov." The Makarov was a pistol. It was a small Soviet-made pistol of a kind the man had used for many years in another life, and which he had taught his hands to disassemble in the dark in under 9 seconds. He did not teach Harry to disassemble it in 9 seconds. He taught Harry, over the course of the spring and into the summer, to disassemble it in any number of seconds at all, because the point at 5 years old was not speed. The point at 5 years old was that the boy's hands learned the shape of the pieces before they learned the shape of the assembled weapon. And the boy, when the assembled weapon was eventually placed in his hands, would understand it the way a chess player understands a board. Not as an object to be manipulated, but as a set of relationships to be respected. By the end of the summer, Harry could field strip the Makarov on a kitchen table in under 2 minutes. He could not yet fire it. He was not allowed to fire it. He was not allowed to point it at anything, including the wall, including the wolf pelt, including the man. He was allowed only to hold the disassembled pieces, to learn their weight, to clean them with a small oiled cloth, and to put them back together in the order the man had shown him. He found that he liked this. He liked the way the small parts settled into each other. He liked the smell of the gun oil. He liked especially that the man trusted him to hold the parts without dropping them, because trust was a thing Harry had never been offered before, and he had developed by the age of 5 a connoisseur's appreciation for it. In the autumn of his 6th year they were in Brasov. The hut outside Brasov was the property of a forester whose father had been the man's contact in 1962, and whose son was now content to receive an occasional envelope of Swiss francs in exchange for never noticing what went on at the end of his access road. The hut had 2 rooms, a tin roof, a well that had to be dug out every spring, and a wide flat clearing behind it where the man had set up a target backstop made of railway ties. Harry, on the first morning of his 6th year, fired a Makarov for the first time. The recoil traveled up his small arm and into his shoulder, and the bullet went into a pine tree several meters to the left of the backstop. And the man, instead of correcting him, told him that this was a very good first shot because nobody had been hurt and the pine tree had been overdue for thinning. Harry, who had braced himself for criticism, looked at the man's face and saw that the man meant it. He fired again. The second shot was closer. He fired 10 rounds that morning. He hit the backstop twice. The man, who had been watching, said only, "Tomorrow, 10 more." Harry, learning the rhythm of the man's pedagogy, understood that 10 meant 10 and that tomorrow meant tomorrow, and that the man would not raise his voice when Harry missed and would not raise his voice when Harry hit, because the man's voice was reserved for moments that mattered, and target practice was practice, and practice was a thing the body did without the voice. By the end of his 6th year, he could put 8 of 10 rounds into the center of a paper plate at 15 meters. By the middle of his 7th year, he could do it left-handed. By the end of his 7th year, he could do it with both hands at 20 meters, and the man, on the evening of his 7th birthday, gave him a knife. The knife was small, single-edged, with a 4-inch blade and a handle of black resin. It was not a toy. The man had explained, over the previous year and in great detail, that a knife was the most personal of weapons and the most likely to be used, that 9 fights in 10 that involved weapons involved knives, that the most dangerous distance in any fight was a meter or less, because at a meter or less the firearm became irrelevant and the knife took over. He taught Harry retention. He taught Harry the close-quarters grip. He taught Harry, with a patience that had not been taught to him by any of his own instructors, but which he had developed somewhere in the cold spaces between his old life and this one, to understand that a knife was not for stabbing but for cutting, and that cutting was a thing one did to make distance, and that distance in any fight was the goal. Harry learned. Harry learned the way a child learns its mother tongue, not consciously in lessons, but in steady accumulation. By the time he was 8, he could disarm the man, who was 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds and had a metal arm, by a combination of leverage and surprise that worked precisely once out of every 50 attempts, which was, the man said, a perfectly respectable ratio. The man permitted himself twice to laugh at Harry's success. The laugh was rusty and surprised them both. Harry filed it away. He had learned in those years 3 languages. English was his first and was the one he dreamed in. Russian was his second, taught alongside firearms and knives and field maintenance, and was the language of work. Czech was his third, taught from a battered grammar the man had found in the Prague apartment, and was the language of bakeries and street directions, and the small old women in the second-hand shops who fed him strudel when he ran errands. He spoke each language with the small, careful diction of a child who had been told that the words mattered. He did not speak any of them as a native, which the man considered a feature. A child with 3 accents was a child no government's intake officer could place, and a child no government's intake officer could place was a child no government's intake officer would chase. The man's English changed across those years. In the first months it had been clipped and overpronounced, with the long, deliberate vowels of a Russian speaker who had been trained to speak English by other Russian speakers. By the end of the 2nd year there was a faint Atlantic in the consonants. By the end of the 3rd the consonants had a shape Harry came eventually to recognize when he met it in an old film some years later as Brooklyn. The man did not announce this transition. The man did not appear to notice it. Harry noticed it. Harry filed it. The man also stopped calling him asset. The transition was gradual and went through mailing key. For a year the word was mailing key. The boy answered to it the way a small dog answers to its name. The man used it for instruction, for inquiry, for the rare moments of approval that came after a particularly good shot or a particularly clean field strip. By the time the boy was 7, the word had begun to alternate with Harry, used at first in formal moments, passport rehearsals, the careful manufacture of school papers for cover stories they would never quite need, and then increasingly in private. By the time the boy was 8, the man called him Harry consistently, and the word mailing key survived only as a term of small endearment, used at the corners of conversations when the boy had done something the man wished, without quite saying so, to mark as good. The magic in those years sorted itself out. The first accidental incident after the cupboard was in Riga. The boy had been 5, had been reaching for a book on a high shelf in the music shop, had wanted the book with the same uncomplicated wanting that had broken open the cryogenic capsule in Hampstead, and the book had come off the shelf and into his hand. The shop's proprietor, who had seen many strange things in her life and had survived all of them by the technique of seeing nothing, did not look up from her counter. The man, who had been standing in the doorway with the recorder in his coat pocket, did look. The man did not speak. The man took the book from Harry's hand, paid for it at the counter without comment, and walked the boy out into the street. They were 2 blocks down before the man said, in a voice carefully neutral, "Show me again." Harry tried. Nothing happened. Harry tried for the better part of an hour, sitting on a bench in the Vermin's Park while the man watched, and the book remained obstinately a book and refused to do anything other than be won. The man at the end of the hour said, "It is not on demand. It is a thing that comes when wanted, not when ordered. We will work with this." Harry, who did not understand most of what the man had said, understood the last sentence, which was that he was not in trouble and that the man would help. The man helped. The man did not understand the magic. The man had never seen the like of it in 50 years of work, but the man understood pedagogy, and the man understood that any system that produced effects in the physical world had to obey, somewhere, rules. The man set out, with the patient rigor of a man who had once disassembled 6 languages in a single year, to find the rules. He had Harry list every accidental incident he could remember. He had Harry describe what he had been feeling, what he had been wanting, what he had been seeing. He had Harry attempt in controlled conditions to reproduce the conditions of each incident: hunger, fear, frustration, the specific brand of cold that came of being locked in a cupboard for an afternoon. Harry, who could not be hungry or frustrated or cold to order, could only ever approximate, but in the approximating, the boy and the man learned together that the magic had a shape. It had a shape, and the shape was want. It moved through the boy when the boy wanted something with the part of himself that did not negotiate. It moved more strongly when the want had a clear object and a clear direction. It moved more accurately when the want was attached to the safety of someone the boy cared about, which by the time the boy was 8 meant a list of one person, and that person was a man with a metal arm who was teaching him to find the rules. By his 8th year, Harry could produce, on demand, a small dim sphere of light in the cup of his hand. He could move a stone, no larger than a fist, across a table by looking at it. He could, with effort, mend a torn page of a book. He could not yet, the man noted with relief and not a little curiosity, kill anyone with the magic. The man did not say so to Harry, but the man considered this an exceptional and durable feature. The man had spent 50 years in proximity to weapons that could kill children. The man preferred, where possible, weapons that could not. The man also worked with Harry on what the man called combinatorics. The man's doctrine was that no weapon stood alone, that every weapon was strongest when paired with another, that a knife and a pistol were stronger together than either by itself, and that a knife and a pistol and a third unexpected instrument were stronger still. The man, with the rigor of a chess master setting up positions, taught Harry to fold the magic into the existing framework. When you draw the knife, can you also dim the light? When you fire the Makarov, can you also push the recoil into the floor? When you are losing the close quarters fight, can you also move the chair behind the man's heel so he falls over it? Harry, by the time he was 8, could do all three. Not reliably, not gracefully, but he could. In the autumn of his 9th year, a Hydra recovery cell caught up with them in Sevastopol. They had moved south for the season, partly because the man wanted to evaluate the Mediterranean network in case it was needed later, partly because Harry had developed a small, thin cough in Riga that the man had attributed to damp, and partly because the man had an old set of safe houses along the Crimean coast that he wished to be certain were either still there or no longer there. They had checked 4 of them by the 2nd week of October. The 5th was a low, whitewashed building above the harbor at Sevastopol that had a kitchen, a back stair, and a flat roof from which one could see the masts of the warships at anchor. The man, on the evening of their arrival, had walked the perimeter twice and pronounced the location adequate. On the morning of their 5th day there, the man had been wrong about the location, because 5 members of a Hydra recovery cell, working from a piece of paper and a hunch and an old set of dossiers, had arrived in 2 vehicles at the bottom of the hill, and the cell's team leader had not survived to reach the front door. The fight took 11 minutes and Harry lived through 9 of them. The first 2 minutes were the man's alone. He had heard the vehicles. He had gone to the window. He had seen, in the manner of a man who recognized very specific signs, what the vehicles were and what the men in them were. He had said one word to Harry, which was the word back, and Harry, who had been drilled for 2 years on the meaning of the word back, and the location of every position designated as a back position in every safe house they had ever occupied, had gone immediately to the small interior storeroom off the kitchen, and closed the door and crouched against the inner wall with the small Beretta. The man had given him 3 months previously held in the 2-handed grip. The man had drilled into him until his arms ached. He waited, he listened. He could hear the man moving through the apartment at the soft, purposeful pace of a man who had not lost a fight in 20 years. He heard glass break. He heard someone say something in Russian, sharp and surprised. He heard a sound he did not have a word for, which he would later understand to be the sound of a metal arm taking a man by the throat and putting that man through a kitchen window. He heard 2 shots from a pistol that was not the man's pistol. He heard nothing from the man's pistol, because the man had not yet drawn it. He heard, in the next 60 seconds, the man kill 3 more men with the metal arm and 1 with his knee against a door frame. And on the 8th minute of the fight he heard the back stair. The back stair was a thing he had been drilled on. The back stair was the thing the man could not cover from the front of the apartment. The back stair was Harry's responsibility. Harry had drilled this. Harry had drilled it for a year. Harry had drilled it without ever actually believing, in the part of himself that was still 9, that he would have to do it. Harry, on the 8th minute of the fight, heard the back stair creak with the weight of an adult man who was trying not to be heard. Harry, in the storeroom, breathed once in and once out, and remembered the way the man had taught him to breathe before a shot, and remembered the way the magic had a shape, and remembered that the shape of the magic was want, and Harry wanted, with the steady, wide want of a boy who had decided that the man he had grown up with was not going to die today, for there to be a wall between the man on the back stair and the storeroom, and the magic moved. It moved silently. It moved with a precision that surprised them both. A pale, shimmering plane unfolded between the storeroom door and the back stair landing, and the man on the back stair, who had been raising his pistol toward the storeroom, walked into it and stopped. He stopped because the plane stopped him. He pushed against the plane and the plane did not move. He shot at the plane and the bullets went into it and did not come out the other side. He shouted in Russian for the rest of his cell, and was at the 3rd syllable of the shout when the man with the metal arm came up the back stair behind him, and the shout ended on the next syllable. The man with the metal arm looked at the plane that Harry had made. The man looked at the storeroom door beyond it. The man, in a voice that was steadier than it should have been after 11 minutes of work, said, "Mailing key, open the door." Harry opened the door. The plane wavered in his peripheral vision and then folded itself away as he stopped wanting it. The man with the metal arm crossed the threshold, dropped to one knee at Harry's eye level, took Harry's small face in the flesh hand and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then the man said, "Protego." "What?" said Harry. "What you made. The word for it is protego. It is a Latin word. It means I shield. This is information I have from a book. We will work on the word together." "All right," said Harry. "You did well." It was the first time the man had ever told him that. Harry, who at 9 had a connoisseur's appreciation for trust and an even finer one for approval, set the moment down in a corner of his head that he would return to many times in the years to come. They left Sevastopol that night. The man drove. Harry sat in the front passenger seat with the small Beretta still in his lap, because the man had not asked him to put it away and Harry had not yet decided to. By dawn, they were in Odessa. By the third night, they were in Lvov. By the end of the week, they were in Krakow. The Krakow safe house was an old apartment in the Jewish quarter, above a tailor's shop, with a view of a small square in which a single chestnut tree had been growing for 200 years. They had been there for 9 days when the letter arrived. It came in the post like a normal letter. It was addressed to Master H. Potter, the loft above Stein & Sons, Plaque Walnica 6, Krakow. The man, who had been collecting the post under a name that was not Potter, did not at first recognize the address as theirs. He brought the letter inside, set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for 2 minutes before opening it. He did not open it. He gave it to Harry. Harry, at not quite 11, read with the steady precision of a boy who had been taught to read by a man who taught everything as though it were a field skill. He opened the letter. He read it. He read it again. He looked up at the man. "What is Hogwarts?" he said. The man took the letter. He read it slowly. He read it twice. He set it down on the kitchen table between them. He took off his coat. He hung it on the back of the chair. He sat down opposite Harry the way he had sat down opposite Harry on the first morning in Prague 7 years ago, and he said, "Hogwarts is, apparently, a school. It is a school in Britain. It is a school for the kind of thing you do. It is a school for the magic." "Britain," said Harry. "Britain," said the man, "where the cupboard was." Where the cupboard was. Harry thought about this. Harry was, by then, a small, thin, nearly 11-year-old with green eyes and dark hair. He had cut himself in a kitchen mirror, who could field strip a Makarov in 38 seconds, and hold a Protego against 5 rounds of 9mm fire, and read in 3 languages and dance, very badly, the polka, which the man had taught him one evening in the Brasov hut, because the man had decided, on some private timetable, that Harry needed to learn at least one frivolous skill. Harry looked at the man across the kitchen table. "Do we go?" said Harry. The man considered the question. The man, in the 7 years since the cupboard, had taken many decisions about Harry's life on Harry's behalf, but the man had increasingly preferred, over the past 2 years, to ask before deciding. The man understood that Harry was now of an age to begin choosing his own ground. The man also understood that the question, asked at this kitchen table, was not really about Hogwarts. The question was about Britain. The question was about the country that had bolted a 4-year-old into a cupboard. The question was about whether Harry, who had been removed from that country at the age of 4 with a broken arm and never asked about it since, was prepared to return to it. The man said, "Do you want to go?" Harry thought about this. Harry thought about it for a long time. The man who had learned to wait waited. "I want to know what I am," said Harry at last. The man nodded once. The man understood the answer. The man also understood the unasked second half of it. "I come with you," said the man. "Yes," said Harry, "they will not want that. I don't care." The man, who had not heard the small, flat conviction in Harry's voice in quite that register before, looked at him for a moment longer and then said, Then we go." He picked up the letter. He folded it. He put it in the inside pocket of the coat that was hanging on the chair. He stood up. He put the kettle on. That night, as Harry slept on the cot in the corner of the Krakow apartment with the small Beretta within reach on the floor beside him, the man sat at the kitchen table and wrote a reply. He wrote it in English. He had not written anything in English in 7 years, and the hand that held the pen had to remember the shape of certain letters before it could produce them. But the words themselves came easily because he had been composing them in his head for a week. To Professor McGonagall he wrote, "Concerning the boy, I come with him. I will be useful. Send instructions to the address you used. Yours, J.B." He sealed the envelope. He addressed it. He propped it against the salt shaker for posting in the morning. Outside in the small square, the chestnut tree dropped a single curled leaf into the snow. A street lamp came on. Somewhere a clock chimed 11. The man with the metal arm sat in the kitchen and watched the boy sleep. And the boy slept the way boys sleep when they have grown up in safe rooms with sharp instructors, which is to say lightly and well. And the man, whose face was, increasingly, the face of a man named Bucky Barnes, who had been born in Brooklyn in 1917 and had not been allowed to remember it for 68 years, folded his hands in his lap and prepared, with the deliberate care of a man who had survived 2 world wars and 1 cryogenic interment, to take a small, thin, nearly 11-year-old back to Britain. There were, across those years, smaller things too. The man taught Harry to cook. This was a discipline the man took as seriously as he took marksmanship. A man who could not feed himself well, the man said, was a man who would, sooner or later, take a meal from someone who poisoned it. Harry learned at 6 to make borscht. He learned at 7 to make goulash. He learned at 8 the particular trick of folding pierogi so the seam held under boiling water. He learned throughout that cooking was a thing one did slowly with the hands and the eyes and almost never with the clock, and that this was true of most things worth doing. The man also taught Harry to read maps. He taught him to read terrain. He taught him, in the long quiet evenings at Brasov, to read the small constellations that came up over the Carpathians in early winter, and to navigate by them. He taught Harry the names of trees in 3 languages, and the names of birds in 2, and the names of the small useful weeds that grew along forest paths in any month, and that could be eaten if one was lost, and had no other recourse. Harry, learning all of it with the steady, attentive ease of a boy who had nothing else to do and only one teacher he loved, absorbed it the way a sponge absorbs water, and did not know, until he met other children, that this was not the way most children grew up. He met few other children. The forester's son outside Brasov had 2 boys near Harry's age, and Harry, on the occasions when the man permitted it, played with them at the edge of the woods. The boys taught Harry to whistle through a blade of grass. Harry taught them, in return, 3 Russian curse words he had picked up by listening at doors. The forester's wife, when she heard the curse words from her boys at supper, came up to the hut with a thin smile and a covered pie dish and addressed the man in fast Romanian. And the man, who spoke Romanian well, listened with his head tilted to one side and apologized formally and accepted the pie. He gave the pie to Harry. He told Harry in private that the curse words were correct in their grammar but inappropriate in their context, and that Harry should consider context. Harry nodded and considered it. There was a girl in Riga the same year. She was 7 and Harry was 5. Her mother ran a flower stall near the music shop. The girl had crooked teeth and a laugh that made other people laugh without meaning to. Harry, in the 7 weeks they were in Riga, learned to recognize her shoes from the back stairs, and to time his trips downstairs so as to be passing the flower stall when she was helping her mother. The girl gave him, on his last day in Riga, a single yellow tulip with a small flat bow tied around the stem. Harry pressed the tulip between 2 pages of the Czech grammar and carried it with him for 2 years before it crumbled. He never mentioned it to the man. The man, who noticed everything, never asked. In the autumn of his 7th year in the Brasov hut, the man permitted Harry to choose his own bedtime for the first time. The choice was offered without ceremony. The man set the kerosene lamp on the table at the usual hour, looked at Harry over the rim of his tea and said, "You will sleep when you are tired." Harry, given this responsibility, sat up for 4 hours past his usual time, reading a translated copy of Treasure Island until the words went blurry. He went to bed at his own initiative at the end of the chapter. He woke the next morning slightly late with a small headache, and the man who had let him sleep in said only, "Now you know." Harry, who took the lesson, set his own bedtime from that day forward. He set it almost always to the hour the man would have set it, not because the man had set it, but because Harry, given the choice, recognized that the man had been correct. Magic in those years had begun to include, beyond the pratigo and the dim light and the small kinetic nudges, what the man called redirect. This was the man's word for what happened when Harry, in a fight drill, used the magic not to defeat a thing but to move it slightly. A knife strike that arrived a hand's breadth from where it had been aimed. A fist that closed on empty air because the head it had been aimed at had been, for 1/2 second, somewhere else. The man, who had fought every kind of body across 40 years of war and clandestine work, had never fought a body that could do this. The man, after the 3rd or 4th drill in which Harry redirected him into the doorframe, declared the technique operational and ordered Harry to use it only as a last resort, because the man understood that a technique used too often became a technique that opponents would anticipate, and the redirect was, in the man's professional opinion, too valuable to spend on routine. By the time the McGonagall letter arrived, Harry had a body of magical doctrine that ran to 17 pages of his own careful handwriting in a small black notebook he kept in the inside pocket of his coat. The doctrine had been developed jointly with the man and was organized along the man's small team principles. The magic was a member of the team, not a replacement for the other members. The pistol still mattered. The knife still mattered. The man with the metal arm still mattered. The magic was a 4th thing in addition to those 3, and the 4 together were stronger than any 3 of them alone. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, Diagon and the Stone. The professor who met them at the Krakow train station was not McGonagall. The professor who met them was a tall, thin man in an oilskin coat with a beard that had begun, even at the end of August, to go silver around the edges, and who introduced himself in careful Polish as Phileas Flitwick. He shook the man's flesh hand. He looked, with frank professional interest, at the metal one. He did not comment on it. He took the train with them to Berlin and the next train to Calais and the boat to Dover, and during the long crossing he taught Harry, in the small forward saloon, a charm for lighting a candle. Harry, who had never used a wand, used one of Flitwick's for the exercise. The candle lit. Flitwick smiled the smile of a man who had taught for 40 years and had not yet stopped enjoying the moment when a child first realized that a piece of wood could do what a piece of wood had no business doing. "You have a strong intent, Mr. Potter," said Flitwick. "It is one of the rarer things. It cannot be taught. The wand is an instrument. The intent is the player. You will play very well." Harry, who had not been praised in 7 years and was therefore not sure what to do with praise, glanced sideways at the man with the metal arm. The man, who had observed the exchange with the steady attention he gave to all exchanges involving Harry, nodded once. Harry, taking the cue, said, "Thank you, sir," and put the wand down. They came into London at dusk on the last day of August. The man took them by tube. He had been thinking about the tube for some weeks, because the tube was the city's circulatory system, and a man returning to a city he had once worked through ought to know what its circulation felt like. And they got off at Charing Cross and walked the last 2 blocks to a small pub Flitwick had named. The pub was called the Leaky Cauldron. The man, who had been in London twice in 1947 and once in 1961, did not remember a pub on this corner, which suggested either that the pub had been added since his last visit or that the pub had been there all along and had not wanted to be remembered. He suspected the latter. Inside the pub, a thin, nervous publican in a yellowed apron looked at the man's coat and then at Harry's scar and went pale. The man, who had observed the going pale, took note of it without commenting. He walked Harry through the bar, out the back door, and into the small yard where Flitwick was already waiting with his wand drawn. Flitwick tapped a brick. Diagon Alley unfolded. Harry stood in the archway for a full 30 seconds and looked. The man beside him did the same. The man's eyes, which had been trained for 60 years to map exits and sightlines and threat surfaces, mapped Diagon Alley in the time it took Harry to register that it was real. And the man, having mapped it, made a small adjustment to his coat to ensure that the metal hand could be drawn from the sleeve in under half a second without snagging the cuff. Then the man looked down at Harry and said, "We will go to the bank first." The bank was Gringotts. The bank was run by goblins. The man, who had been told in advance what the bank was and who ran it, did not so much as blink at the goblin who met them at the doors. He spoke to the teller in careful, formal English. He had Flitwick translate where the formality was inadequate. He withdrew, from a vault he had not known belonged to Harry, a quantity of gold that the man considered prudent for school supplies and operational reserves, and a small iron-bound box that contained a few items of Lily Potter's that the man recognized only later, when Harry took them out at the kitchen table of the small flat they had rented in Charing Cross, as belonging to the boy's mother. The man, on seeing the items, said only, "These are yours. We will keep them safe." Harry, who had not known he had a mother in any tangible sense beyond a photograph Flitwick had once shown him, set the items carefully into the inside pocket of his coat and did not bring them out for a year. They bought robes. The fitting at Madame Malkin's took longer than it should have because Madame Malkin, who was a kind woman with a great deal of practical experience and not very much patience, found herself with a tape measure pressed against a sleeve that turned out to contain a forearm of vibranium, and had to begin again. The man, when she looked at him with her tape measure in her hand and an expression that asked what she ought to do, said only, "Measure the other arm. The 2 are mirror." She measured the other arm. She made the robe to that measurement and added a generous fall of cloth at the wrist on the left. The man, when he tried on the robe in the dressing room, found that the cloth fell well over the metal and that he was, from the elbow down, indistinguishable from any other tall, thin man in dark cloth. The cauldron came from a shop that sold cauldrons. The books came from a shop that sold books. The man in the bookshop bought 4 additional volumes beyond Harry's required list: a Latin dictionary, a treatise on defensive magic written by a Russian wizard whose name the man recognized vaguely from old intelligence files, a chess problems book, and a slim volume of poetry by a man named Yeats. He paid in gold. The shopkeeper, who had been about to ask a question, looked at the gold and at the metal hand and decided to let the question wait. They went last to Ollivander's. The shop was empty. The bell over the door rang. Ollivander, who had been waiting somewhere in the back stacks for them, came forward on quiet feet and looked at Harry with the steady, pale eyes of a man who measured wands for a living and had not bothered, in living memory, to learn to measure anything else. "Mr. Potter," he said. "Yes, sir," said Harry. "It seems only yesterday that your mother and father came in here to buy their first wands." The man with the metal arm, standing in the corner, listened to this with the same neutral attention he gave to anything else. The shop smelled of dust and varnish, and a faint ozonic sharpness Harry would later associate with concentrated magic. The man's eyes moved across the racks of long, thin boxes. The man considered briefly what would be required to render the shop non-operational from a tactical perspective, and concluded that the racks themselves were the principal problem, and then dismissed the calculation because the shop was not a target. The man had been working through such calculations involuntarily since he was 20. He no longer noticed himself doing it. Ollivander measured Harry. Ollivander handed Harry a wand. Harry held it. Nothing happened. Ollivander, with the soft, pleased expression of a man whose work was rarely uninteresting, took the wand back and handed Harry another. Nothing happened. Ollivander, after 3 further wands, looked at Harry for a long moment and went into the back of the shop. He came back with a single thin box. The box had the look of a thing that had been put away for a long time. "Holly," he said, 11 inches, nice and supple, a wand of contradictions, this one, powerful and steadying, phoenix feather core. Harry took the wand. The wand fit in his hand like an extension of his radius. He raised it. A small, clean wind moved across the back of the shop and lifted, just briefly, the dust off the top of 3 boxes. Ollivander made a quiet, pleased noise. The man with the metal arm in the corner allowed himself the half-millimeter of facial movement that, in his current vocabulary, served as a nod of professional approval. "That one," said Ollivander, "is a very curious wand for you to have." He said it in a tone Harry did not entirely follow. The man with the metal arm followed it. The man, who had developed in his long career a fine ear for the sentence that meant more than its words, watched Ollivander's pale eyes and said, in the formal English he had been using since he came into the shop, "Why, curious." Ollivander looked at the man. Ollivander appeared to register, for the first time, the metal arm. "Because," said Ollivander after a small pause, "the phoenix who gave that feather gave one other, just one. And it is curious indeed that Mr. Potter should be the wielder of one and the other should belong to him who gave him that scar." "Voldemort," said Harry, who had been told the name on the boat from Calais by Flitwick. "Yes, Mr. Potter, Voldemort. We can expect great things from you. Terrible, but great." The man with the metal arm did not move and did not change his face. He took, however, a small, quiet step closer to Harry. Harry, who registered the step the way one registers a familiar weight settling into a chair beside one, did not look at the man. The man paid for the wand. The man led Harry out of the shop. In the street the man stopped. He looked at Harry. He said, "Holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, supple, you will carry it where I will see it. You will draw it when I tell you, and you will draw it before I tell you on the day I am not fast enough. Do you understand me?" "Yes," said Harry. "Good." They walked back through the alley. The man stopped on the way out at a small shop that sold knives and other useful things. The man bought a folding pocket knife for Harry and a sharpening stone of his own. He also bought, at a corner stall that sold odd, hard-to-classify wares, a small box of bullets cast in pure silver. He did not explain the bullets. Harry, who had learned not to ask about the man's small operational habits, did not ask. The wand was holly. The pocket knife had a brass bolster. The bullets in their box in the man's inside pocket made a soft seed-like rattle. They went home. They slept 4 hours in the rented flat off Charing Cross. They took, the next morning, a hired car to King's Cross. The platform was platform 9 3/4. Harry walked through the brick wall with the man's flesh hand on his shoulder. The wall did the small inhalation a wall does when accommodating a magical traveler, and Harry stepped out onto a platform that smelled of steam and oil, and the particular blend of brass polish and old leather that a steam locomotive emits at rest. The man, who had not boarded a steam train in 50 years, looked at the engine with the small professional appreciation a craftsman gives another craft. He nodded once at it. He turned to Harry. He said, "Find a compartment near the rear. 2 carriages from the back. Sit on the right-hand side of the train when seated facing the front. I will be 3 compartments forward." "You're not coming," said Harry. "I have arranged for a separate carriage. The arrangements were made with the headmaster. I will be on the train. I will be there when you arrive. I will be there for the rest of the year." "Why 3 compartments forward?" "Because at 3 compartments I can be in your compartment in under 2 seconds, and the compartments between will see me first." Harry, who had not asked the question for a tactical answer but who took the tactical answer gratefully, nodded once and went up the steps of the train. He found the compartment. It was on the right-hand side of the train. He set his trunk under the seat. He sat by the window. He read a chapter of A Tale of Two Cities, which the man had given him on the previous evening with the simple instruction to begin it on the journey, and which the man had said was a useful book about the way men behaved when their countries told them things they could not abide. Harry was 8 pages in when the compartment door opened. The girl who came in had a great deal of brown hair, a face like a sharp small bird, and an expression of someone who had not yet decided whether to be polite or to be brisk and was therefore being both. She said, "Has anyone seen a toad? A boy named Neville has lost his." "No," said Harry. "Sorry." The girl looked at him. The girl looked at his wand on the seat beside him. The girl looked at his trunk. The girl looked at the closed door of the compartment. "You're Harry Potter," said the girl. "Yes," said Harry. "I'm Hermione Granger. Have you read all the books for first year?" "I have. They're really very good." She stopped. She had registered in the corner of her eye the figure of a tall man in a dark coat passing in the corridor outside the compartment. She had registered, more specifically, the left sleeve of the dark coat, from which, for the briefest of moments as the man turned, the smallest segment of a metal finger had emerged. She turned back to Harry. Her face had gone, in a single breath, the slate color of a child who had read enough adult books to recognize a thing she had read about. "Who is that?" she said. It was not a question. "That is James," said Harry. "He has a metal hand." "Yes." Is he?" She stopped. She did not have the word. Harry, who did not have a word for the man that would be useful to Hermione, considered the available vocabulary, discarded all of it, and settled on the truth. "He looks after me," said Harry. Hermione, who was sharp and small and had read enough adult books to know that the children in the books rarely had adults who looked after them with metal hands, looked at Harry for a long moment. Then she sat down. She sat down on the opposite seat. She folded her hands in her lap. She said in a slightly higher voice than she had used for the toad, "Tell me about him." Harry told her. He told her in the careful diction of a boy who had been raised to be precise and who had also been raised not to lie, and who was navigating the gap between those two by selecting which truths to tell. He told her that James had taken care of him since he was 4. He told her that James had taught him to read. He told her that James had taught him a number of skills he could not, at the moment, demonstrate in a train compartment without making her nervous. He told her after some thought that James had a metal arm because he had been hurt a long time ago, and the metal arm was the result. Hermione, who knew the difference between a fact and an explanation, did not press. Later in the journey the door opened a second time, and a red-headed boy with a smudge on his nose said, "Anyone sitting here? Everywhere else is full." Harry said no. No one was sitting there, and the red-headed boy sat down. He was Ron Weasley. He spent the first 10 minutes telling Harry about his older brothers. He spent the second 10 minutes telling Harry about chocolate frog cards. He spent the third 10 minutes asking in the casual, confiding way of a boy who had not yet learned that some things were not asked. "Hey, is it true the bloke with the metal hand is your uncle?" Harry blinked. "Where did you hear that?" "Fred and George. They saw him on the platform. They said his fingers ticked." "Is it?" Harry, who had not yet decided what the man was, said, "He's not my uncle, he's something else." "What does it do?" said Ron, who had decided in his own head that something else was a sufficient answer. "It's strong," said Harry, "and it's cold. Cold, always. Brilliant," said Ron. He said it the way an 11-year-old says brilliant when he has, in his short life, never seen a thing more brilliant than a chocolate frog card. Harry, who had not had a friend, registered the brilliant with the same care he had given Hermione's slow, careful question, and filed both away for further consideration. The Sorting Hat, 3 hours later, took rather longer with Harry than with any of the other first years. It muttered. It said plenty of courage, and a thirst to prove yourself, and not a bad mind either, my goodness. And what is this in here? The last said in a tone that suggested the hat had encountered something it was not used to encountering. The hat eventually said, in a quieter voice meant for Harry only, "I see what your guardian has done in you. I see how you have been built. You could go anywhere. Where do you want to go, son?" Harry, who had not been called son by anything before, considered the hat with the dignity of a boy who had thought about this question for the duration of the boat from Calais and had decided. Gryffindor, he thought back. The hat that takes the soldier should send him where the soldiers needed. The hat made a small pleased sound and shouted Gryffindor to the hall. At the staff table, a tall, pale man with black hair and a black robe looked across the hall at the doorway through which the man with the metal arm had quietly entered, and which the man with the metal arm was now standing in. The tall, pale man held the look for several seconds. The man with the metal arm met the look. Neither of them spoke. The tall, pale man inclined his head a careful quarter of an inch. The man with the metal arm returned the gesture with the same precision. They had recognized each other across the staff table as a particular species of professional recognizes another, which is to say, without language, without warmth, and without the slightest expectation of friendship, but with the absolute confidence that, in any room they shared from now on, each would know where the other was. The headmaster had spoken to Hagrid about Harry's protector several weeks before. Hagrid, who was a great, kind, decent man and had no operational frame for what the headmaster had described, had said, "A what, sir?" And the headmaster, with the small, wry smile of a man who had been asked this question before in different rooms, had said, "An old soldier of a great many wars." Hagrid, who has chosen, in the way old soldiers sometimes do, to spend the remainder of his service on a single thing. Don't be alarmed by him. Hagrid, when he encountered the man in the entrance hall before the feast, had been alarmed by him for approximately 8 seconds, and had then decided, with the kindness that was the unalterable structure of his soul, that any creature who had been entrusted with the care of Harry Potter was, by that single fact, a creature Hagrid could find it in himself to be polite to. He had offered the man tea. The man had accepted. They had drunk it standing up in the entrance hall while the first years went up the steps from the boats, and Hagrid had asked, with the soft awe of a man who admired well-made things, "Ye wouldn't mind if I had a look at the arm sometime, would ye?" And the man had said in his clipped, careful English, "Sometime. Yes." By midnight Harry was in the Gryffindor dormitory. By 1:30, Hermione had cornered him near the common room fire to say, in a low, precise voice, "I read up. I read several books. Your guardian is something I had not seen mentioned in any of them, and I have been doing some thinking, and I have decided, on the strength of evidence, that he is probably not entirely magical and is also probably not entirely safe, and that you, on the strength of evidence, are also not entirely safe, and I should very much like to be your friend if you would have me." Harry, who had not had a friend, gave the matter the consideration he gave to all serious offers, and accepted hers with a small, careful nod. Ron, who had been listening from the next chair and had not been entirely sure what Hermione had said, took it as an invitation and shook Harry's hand with great enthusiasm. By 1 in the morning Harry had 2 friends. By 2 he was asleep. The man slept in a small room off the caretaker's office that Dumbledore had made available to him. The room had a cot, a stove, a window that overlooked the front lawn, and a single chair set at an angle from which both the door and the window could be watched at once. The man sat in the chair until 2 in the morning. Then he lay down on the cot, slept 4 hours, and rose with the autumn dawn. The first month was uneventful. The second month was uneventful in the way the man preferred his months. He had learned the layout of the castle, the patrol patterns of the 4 heads of house, the schedule of the ghosts, and the small particular weaknesses of the third-floor corridor, which had been declared out of bounds in a manner that suggested either great theatricality or great inadequacy. The man, after careful observation, concluded both. He filed the corridor as a matter to be investigated. He did not investigate it immediately. He waited. The thing in the corridor would, if it was a thing worth investigating, declare itself. It declared itself at Halloween, when a mountain troll was permitted, by inattention or by design, into the dungeons. The man was in the caretaker's office when the announcement came. He was out of the chair and at the door within 1 second of hearing it. He had located Harry in his mental map of the castle within a second more. He moved toward the location at a pace the man considered moderate. He arrived at the second-floor girls' lavatory at the moment Harry and Ron, who had not been at the feast for reasons Harry would later explain involved Hermione's crying in a stall, had located the troll, and the troll had located Hermione. The man in the doorway took stock. Troll, 12 feet tall, half a ton, club, low reach, slow. Children, 3, one of them his, one of them the redhead, one of them the small, sharp girl from the train. Tactical assessment, irrelevant. The man stepped sideways into the room, closed the door behind him with the heel of his boot to prevent additional civilian entry, and crossed to the troll at a pace that was not, by then, moderate. He did not draw his pistol. The pistol was for other situations. He took the troll's club out of the troll's hand by the simple expedient of catching the club in the metal hand on its downswing, which arrested the club, and then drawing the club out of the troll's grip with a small twist that broke 3 of the troll's fingers. The troll roared. The man went under the roar to the troll's knee. The metal arm closed at the joint. The joint gave way. The troll went down. The metal arm closed at the troll's neck. The neck did what necks do, even on trolls, when something with a tensile strength considerably greater than vertebra applies force to them at speed. The troll was, after 11 seconds, no longer a problem. Harry, who had been in the process of casting a levitation charm at the time, lowered his wand. Ron, who had been about to attempt a Wingardium Leviosa at a club that was now in the wrong hands, lowered his. Hermione, who had stopped crying at the first sound of the man's boots, looked up from the floor by the sinks. Professor McGonagall came in through the door 3 seconds later. She took in the lavatory. She took in the troll. She took in the man. She took in the 3 first years. "Mr. Barnes," she said, in a voice carefully composed, "Professor, I had been led to understand that your role here was advisory. It is. This troll was advising the children to scream." McGonagall, who had been a professor for a great many years, had the rare ability to identify a joke from a man who had not made one in 50. She regarded him with a long, thoughtful look. 20 points to Gryffindor, she said. "For the children. Mr. Barnes, see me in my office in the morning." "Yes, ma'am." She turned to the children. Hermione, with the sharp instinct of a small girl who had read a great many books, opened her mouth and took the responsibility for the troll on herself. Harry, who saw what she was doing, kept silent. Ron, who had not yet thought through the consequences of speaking, looked at the man, who had already left the lavatory, and chose silence. McGonagall did not believe a word of Hermione's story, but allowed it to stand, and went away to alert the headmaster. By December, Harry, Ron, and Hermione had become the kind of inseparable that begins when one of you has been saved by your friend's odd uncle from a troll. By the start of the spring term, they had also worked out that the third-floor corridor contained a three-headed dog, that the dog stood on a trapdoor, that the trapdoor led down, and that the down led to a chamber that contained, in some form, a thing worth guarding. By April they had begun to suspect, on the strength of small clues observed by Hermione and stitched together by Harry, that the thing being guarded was the Philosopher's Stone and that one of the professors was trying to take it. Harry took the suspicions to the man one evening in the caretaker's office. The man listened. The man asked 7 precise questions. The man, by the end of the 7th question, had developed an operational picture that ran considerably further than Harry's own. The man said, "Quirrell. How did you?" He stutters in the wrong direction. The man's stutter is selective. He uses it as cover. I noticed it in September. I have been observing him. Why didn't you say? I had no evidence. Now you have given me some. We will wait. We will let him move. When he moves, I will be 3 meters behind him. Harry, who had been afraid of nothing but the unknown shape of the thing his guardian had been keeping from him, nodded once and went to the common room. The move came on the 2nd of June. Dumbledore had been called away. By means the man considered designed. The corridor was unwatched. By design, Quirrell, by design or by accident or by both, was on his way down through the trapdoor before the man could intercept him. The man, who had been on the 3rd floor at the time, went down through the trapdoor 20 seconds after him. Harry, who had been on the 1st floor with Ron and Hermione, and had observed the man crossing the 7th floor landing with a particular set of his shoulders, went up to follow, then down, then sideways through a passage Hermione had read about, and arrived at the chamber of the mirror 11 minutes after the man. He arrived in time to see the end of it. The chamber was high-ceilinged and round. The mirror of Eris stood in the center on a small dais. Quirrell stood before the mirror. The man stood 3 meters behind Quirrell. Quirrell's wand was on the floor, snapped neatly in 2. Quirrell's hidden knife was also on the floor, with its blade bent at the angle of a thing that had been bent across a knee. And Quirrell, who had been turning very slowly in the moment of Harry's entrance, was already, by then, no longer a man whose body could be expected to perform. The man, with the cold professional courtesy he applied to all such matters, said in clear English, "Harry, the mirror." Now, Harry stepped forward. He looked at the mirror. He understood, in the slow, careful way he understood most things, what the mirror was for. He looked at himself in it. He looked at the small reflection of himself that was in the mirror holding the stone. He understood the mechanism. He wanted, with the steady wide want of a boy who had decided that the stone should not exist for the use of the thing on the back of Quirrell's head, for the reflection in the mirror to give him what it was holding, and the stone, with the small, impossible logic of the mirror's enchantment, was in his pocket. He pulled it out. It was small. It was red. It was, he could feel, very old. The thing on the back of Quirrell's head spoke. It said, in a voice with too many sibilants, "Give me the stone, boy." Harry, who had been raised by a man who had taught him to think under pressure, did not answer. Harry closed his fist around the stone. Harry, who had been drilled for a year in the doctrine of redirect, did the smallest possible kinetic thing. He pushed, with the magic, the stone against the unyielding marble of the dais and pushed, and the stone, which was, fundamentally, a thing whose value was the binding of its parts, broke, soundlessly, in his fist. The thing on the back of Quirrell's head screamed. The scream was, for Harry, the worst sound he had ever heard. The scream was, for the man with the metal arm, who had heard a great many sounds in his life, recognizable. It was the sound of a thing that had been counting on something and had been wrong. The man did not regard it. The man finished what he had begun with Quirrell, which was the small, precise neutralization of the host, and stepped back as the wraith of the thing that had been on the back of Quirrell's head detached itself, in a long, pale tendril, and went out through the high window of the chamber, screaming into the night. It would, the man thought, be back. The man did not say so to Harry. The man crossed to Harry, knelt at his eye level, took the broken stone out of Harry's fist and turned the dust of it out onto the marble dais. He put the empty hand in his pocket. He took Harry's hand. He led Harry out of the chamber. In the corridor on the way up, Harry said, "I'd like to sit down for a minute." The man stopped. He sat down on the corridor floor with his back to the wall. Harry sat down beside him. They sat for several minutes without speaking. Harry, after a while, leaned against the man's shoulder. The man permitted this. The man, who had not, since the train station at Krakow, permitted himself to think the words adopted son about Harry, because he had not been sure he had the right to them, thought them briefly in the corridor on the floor of Hogwarts and put them away again for later examination. "It's not over," said Harry. "No," said the man. "He's going to come back." "Yes." "Will you be here?" "I will be here." "Good," said Harry. They got up. They went back to the dormitory, the way two people go who had finished a long shift, which is to say, with a small lean against each other neither of them would have called by that name. The corridor lights, set to the 7th floor pattern of June, came on as they passed. Chapter 3, End Chapter 4. The champion without choice. The summer between Harry's 3rd and 4th years was the longest summer he had ever had. The man had taken him, in late June, back across the Channel and through France and into Italy, and they had spent 4 weeks in a stone house in Liguria that the man had used twice before in his career, and that had a small orchard of stone fruits behind it, and a long view of the sea from the front window. Harry, who had had 3 intense years of school and friends and trolls and basilisks and dementors, and a thing about a wraith and a body that the man kept careful daily track of, had been ordered on the first morning at the stone house to do nothing for a week. He had not at first known how. The man, after the first 3 days of watching Harry attempt to clean the kitchen, had finally taken the broom out of his hand and said, "Sit on the terrace. Read the Yeats. If you find you are tired enough, sleep." Harry, who had been told to do nothing for a week and who had decided that nothing was on consideration, a skill that needed to be drilled like any other, took the man at his word, sat on the terrace with the Yeats and slept for 2 days. By the end of the 4 weeks, Harry was a different shape. The faint pallor he had carried out of June had filled in. His shoulders had broadened a centimeter. He had begun, in the orchard behind the house, to practice combinations of magic and footwork that the man had not seen him try in school, and the man, watching from the kitchen window in the long afternoons, made small adjustments to his mental syllabus for the year ahead. They returned to Britain in late August. They spent a fortnight in a small London flat that the man had been keeping under one of his cover names for 30 years, and which had not in that time been compromised. And they did the school shopping in Diagon Alley with the quiet efficiency of people who had done it before. Hagrid, when they passed him outside Florian Fortescue's, had clapped the man on the back with a heartiness the man had learned to absorb without disrupting his stance, and had said, "Ye look well, the both of ye." The man, who had developed for Hagrid the particular tolerant affection one develops for a large dog who consistently misjudges its own size, nodded in acknowledgement. Harry, who had not seen Hagrid in 2 months, hugged him. The Triwizard Tournament announcement at the welcoming feast went, for the man with the metal arm, as he had expected it to go. He had read the relevant section of the Quidditch World Cup news in the Prophet and had begun, some weeks before, to revise his protective doctrine to take account of the introduction of 2 further schools' worth of foreign students into the castle. He had walked the new perimeters that the school had installed around the carriages and the lakeship. He had identified the Durmstrang headmaster as a man whose carriage he would not have been comfortable having his back to, and the Beauxbatons headmistress as a person whose half-giant heritage suggested that he should not, if it could be avoided, find himself in a small room with her in a bad mood. He had filed all of this. In the small black notebook, he had begun to carry in the inside pocket of his coat, alongside Harry's small black notebook of magical doctrine, and had marked the tournament as Category 2, dangerous, expected, manageable. He had not foreseen the goblet. He had not foreseen the goblet because the goblet was not, in his prior reading, a thing that anyone had ever made dangerous in the way the goblet was about to be made dangerous. The goblet was, in the form it had been advertised, a tournament administrator. The man, who had been an administrator of tournaments in his own way for many years, had not expected an administrator to misadminister. When Harry's name came out of the goblet, the man was standing along the wall of the great hall at his usual unobtrusive position. He had been observing, in his peripheral vision, the Karkaroff at the staff table. Karkaroff had been observing, in his own peripheral vision, the man, and the two of them had been, by then, mutually aware for approximately 3 weeks. The man had identified Karkaroff in the first week as a man who had once worked for an organization the man had once worked for, and Karkaroff had identified the man, after some hesitation, as the operational ghost story that had circulated through Karkaroff's old organization in the late 1960s, and which Karkaroff had been told on his retirement was not real. It was real. It was, in fact, standing along the wall of the great hall not 20 meters from him, and as Harry Potter's name floated out of the goblet of fire in the proprietary blue flame, Karkaroff did the small, involuntary thing that men do in the moment before they decide whether to run. The man with the metal arm did not run. The man with the metal arm crossed the hall to the staff table at the unobtrusive pace he reserved for moments in which an entire hall of children was watching, took Harry's elbow at the moment Harry was being herded by McGonagall toward the antechamber, and walked at his pace into the antechamber with him. He stood in the antechamber against the door. He did not speak. He listened to the headmasters argue. He listened to the ministry official. He listened to Crouch. He listened to Bagman. He listened to Snape. He did not, in any of the listening, change his expression. When the talking had run itself out and Dumbledore had pronounced, with the quiet sorrow of a man who had been outmaneuvered by an instrument he had himself helped to enchant, that Harry would compete, the man with the metal arm did the only thing he had come into the antechamber to do, which was to fix Karkaroff with a single steady look for the duration of 3 seconds. Karkaroff, who had been deciding for the past 5 minutes whether to be very brave or very small, decided to be very small. The man with the metal arm, satisfied that the decision had been made and would hold, left the antechamber. He walked Harry back through the hall and up to the Gryffindor common room. He waited outside the portrait until Harry was inside. He went back to the caretaker's office. He sat down at the desk. He took out his notebook. He wrote on a fresh page the word DRAGONS, underlined it twice, and began to make a list. The list was complete by midnight. The list included 3 contingencies for each of the 4 breeds of dragon then current on the British Reserve, with sub-contingencies for clutch status, weather, footing, and the particular psychology of the species. The list also included a 5th contingency labeled summoning, with 3 sub-options the man considered viable, and a 6th contingency labeled ME, with 1 sub-option that was a single word in the man's handwriting. Number the man had thought, at midnight, about the 6th contingency for 40 seconds. He had concluded, at the end of 40 seconds, that any solution to the dragon that involved the man with the metal arm crossing the boundary onto the field would be a solution that taught Harry that the man could be assumed in any future operational context, and that this lesson was, in the long term, more dangerous to Harry than the dragon was. He had crossed out the 6th contingency. He had left the list with the first 5 and gone to bed. In the morning he taught Harry the dragon doctrine. He taught it the way he had taught the Makarov, which is to say slowly, with diagrams. Harry, After 2 days of intensive review and one practical exercise involving the man's metal hand and a moving target, settled on the fifth contingency, which was the summoning of the broom and the use of flight as a repositioning tool, with 3 sub-contingencies for course correction. The man, who had not known Harry could fly, had observed Harry on a broom for a single 15-minute session on the practice pitch, and adjusted his syllabus accordingly. He had said, with what Harry had recognized as approval, "You will do this." The first task, accordingly, did not go badly. The Hungarian horntail was, on the morning of the first task, in a state the man considered favorable. The female had clutched within the past week, which had her in a defensive posture rather than an aggressive one, and the footing was wet. Harry, on his broom, executed the fifth contingency with the calm of a boy who had been drilled in worse on rooftops in Brassa. He did the small wind redirect across the dragon's eyes that the man and he had worked out in the previous evening, drew the dragon's flame 2 meters off-axis from the egg, descended low, took the egg, ascended at the optimal angle the man had drawn for him on a napkin 3 days previously, and came out of the arena with a forearm singed where his sleeve had brushed the edge of a flame and the cheers of a stadium in his ears. The man met him at the medical tent. The man took Harry's arm. The man examined the burn with the clinical care of a medic who had treated several thousand burns. The man said, "Madame Pomfrey will manage this in a moment. Drink the potion she gives you. Eat a proper meal tonight. Do not allow Skeeter to corner you in any corridor." Then he stepped back and let Madame Pomfrey through. Harry, who had had a long morning, smiled at the man for the first time in 2 days. The man, who registered the smile, did the half-millimeter of facial movement that by now had become an audible answer to Harry. They walked back to the castle together. Karkaroff, watching from across the field, did not approach. The second event of note that autumn was the Yule Ball. Harry, who had been to dances precisely 0 times in his life, and who had been informed by Hermione during breakfast in mid-November that the Yule Ball was something he was now required to attend, considered his options. He considered them with the systematic care he had been taught. He considered them across a week and arrived at the conclusion, on the Sunday afternoon, that he did not want to go. He took the conclusion to the man. He took it in the caretaker's office. In the slow, patient way the man had taught him to bring decisions to him. He laid out the reasoning. The reasoning was that Harry did not know how to dance, that he had no intention of learning by Christmas, that the ball was at night in a hall full of strangers and foreign students, with weather expected to interfere with sightlines, and that he, Harry, would be the conspicuous absence rather than the conspicuous presence, and that he would prefer to be neither but, if forced to choose, would prefer the former. The man listened. The man considered the reasoning. The man asked, "How will your friends take this?" "Hermione has a date, Ron does not. Then Ron will need company. I will not be Ron's company. Ron's company is supposed to be a girl. This is true. We will arrange that he is occupied. There is a 4th-year girl who has been looking at him for some weeks. Have you noticed?" Harry, who had not noticed, said, "Number Lavender Brown. She finds him interesting. We will arrange that he asks her." "How do we arrange that?" "We have Hermione mention to Lavender that Ron is, in her view, not as foolish as he appears." "That's not strictly true." "It is exactly as true as it needs to be. Hermione will deliver it. Ron will be invited. He will accept. He will be occupied." Harry, who had not previously been advised by the man on the question of 4th-year girls, took the advice with the polite attention he gave the man's other operational instructions and conveyed it to Hermione that evening. Hermione, who had been about to mention something similar to Lavender on her own initiative, said only "of course," and went off to do it. By Wednesday, Ron had a date. By Thursday, Lavender had a dress robe. By Friday, Harry's absence from the Yule Ball was a settled fact. The man, on the night of the ball, was not visible to the boys and girls in the hall, but he was in the castle. He had taken up a position in the upper gallery above the great hall, Behind a tapestry the staff did not frequent in the evenings. From the gallery he could see the exits, the staff table, the headmaster's chair, the orchestra, and crucially, both champion entrances. He had been there for 20 minutes when he heard the boots on the gallery stair. The boots were too even. The man knew the gait of every staff member at Hogwarts by sound. He knew McGonagall's brisk Scottish stride, and Flitwick's small fast trip, and Snape's silent, unhurried glide, and Sprout's earnest tramp, and Sinistra's even tread. The boots on the gallery stair were even, but they were not Sinistra's. They had a small, persistent hitch on the right foot, the kind of hitch that came of an old prosthesis breaking in. They belonged to the new defense professor, Mad-Eye Moody. The man with the metal arm had been in the same room as Moody several times in the previous 3 months, and had not previously had occasion to evaluate him at close quarters. He had not yet drawn a conclusion. He had identified, in the prior weeks, a small number of things about Moody that did not quite cohere, but he had not been certain whether they were the incoherences of a man who had survived a long war by behaving incoherently, or whether they were the incoherences of a man playing a role. Moody came up onto the gallery. He stopped 3 meters from the man. The man, who had been standing against the tapestry, did not turn his head. "Quiet up here," said Moody. The voice was Moody's. The cadence was Moody's. The cadence had a half-syllable hesitation in the unstressed positions that the cadence of a Moody who had been Moody for 60 years would not have had. The man, who had spent his life training his ear, marked the hesitation. "It is," said the man. "You're the one looks after the Potter boy." "I am. Funny arrangement." "It is." Moody did not move. The eye that the man could see, the magical one, was rotating slowly, taking in the hall below. The eye that the man could not see was, the man assumed, doing the same. There was a small smell off Moody. It was not the smell of a man who had been Moody for 60 years. It was the smell of a hip flask kept on a man too young to have earned the right to it. The smell of the flask itself was not on Moody. The smell of what was in the flask was. The man had identified the smell in the 2nd week of term and had been waiting since then for confirmation. "Where do you come from, Mr. Barnes?" said Moody in a tone of light conversation. "From Brooklyn," said the man, "originally, by way of a great many other places." "Brooklyn's an interesting answer for a man with that accent." "My accent is what is left after the other places." "Do you have a question for me, Professor?" "I'd like to interview you. I'm responsible for the children's defense. I find I'd be a poor man at that work if I didn't understand the people who walk the corridors at night." "You may interview me at any time," said the man. "I will, in turn, interview you." "That's an unusual answer." "I have an unusual job." Moody, behind the man, said nothing for a moment. The magical eye continued to rotate. The other eye, the man could feel without turning, was fixed on the back of the metal hand at the man's side. The man, who had decided some weeks before that the thing Moody was reading in him was a thing only an actual Mad-Eye Moody could read, and that an actual Mad-Eye Moody would not be reading him in this manner, allowed his metal fingers to make, against the wall behind him, the smallest possible motion. The motion was, to anyone watching, indistinguishable from the unconscious finger tapping of a man at ease. The man, who was decidedly not at ease, was nonetheless aware that he was being watched and had chosen, in the way he had chosen most of his life, to allow the watcher to come closer. "You'll come down to my office tomorrow at 3, said Moody. "I will." "Good." The boots receded down the gallery stair. The man waited a full minute. He did not look at the place where the boots had been. He moved instead to the small slit in the curtain through which he could see the lower stair and watched Moody descend. He watched Moody cross the corridor. He watched Moody go into the staff entry to the hall. Then the man, with the small efficient movement of a man who has decided a thing, took the small black notebook from his coat, opened to a fresh page, and wrote, "Moody equals imposter. Confirmation pending. Do not engage, long game. He underlined long game twice. He went down to the office at 3 the next afternoon. He sat across the desk from the man calling himself Moody. He answered with the cooperative blandness of an old soldier who had been interviewed many times by official curiosities, the questions Moody put to him. He did not give Moody any answer that mattered. He did not show Moody his hand. He did, in the course of the interview, allow Moody to see that the man's left arm did not respond to the small, revealing charm that Moody, with the casual, unprofessional carelessness of a man trying to be more clever than he was, slipped in among the otherwise harmless questions. The man, who had been watching for the charm because he had read about it in the defense text the previous summer, did the small thing necessary to make the arm appear, to Moody's magical eye, as ordinary flesh, and continued the interview at the bland, steady pace he had set. Moody, when the interview was over, had concluded that the man with the metal arm was an old Muggle veteran with a mild prosthesis, no operational significance, and no inconvenient interest in the defense professor. The man, when the interview was over, had concluded that the imposter was a competent operator but not a great one, that the imposter was running a plan that involved the tournament, that the plan probably involved Harry, and that the plan would, if not interrupted, come to its head no earlier than the second task and no later than the third. He went back to the caretaker's office. He made tea. He sat down at the desk. He revised the contingencies in his notebook. He did not, in the revision, allow himself to write any contingency that he had not, by the time he had finished writing it, mentally rehearsed at least 3 times. Harry came in at 6, as he sometimes did before supper, and sat on the edge of the desk. The man, without looking up, pushed the second mug of tea across to him. "How did it go?" said Harry. "He is not Moody." "I know." The man looked up. Harry was looking at him with the steady evaluative gaze that he had been giving the man in various calibrations since he had been 4 years old. "How long have you known?" said the man. 3 weeks. He doesn't drink the way Moody used to. Hermione lent me her copy of Compendium of Defenders of the Realm. It has Moody's habits in it. Moody drinks gin. Whoever is in there drinks polyjuice. The man, who had not until that sentence had a name for what Moody was drinking, set down his pen. The man considered Harry for some seconds. The man said, "Polyjuice. It's a potion. It lets you take the form of another person. It needs a piece of the other person and a long brew. Hermione found it in a restricted book. She doesn't know I know." "Why does Hermione not know that you know?" "Because if she knew that I knew, she would be unable to stop herself from acting, and I needed time to decide what to do." The man, who had registered with quiet pride that the small, thin boy on the edge of his desk was, at 14, reasoning like a colleague, said, "And what have you decided?" "I have decided to let you decide." "Then I will tell you what I have decided. We let him run. We let him take us to the third task. We watch him there. When he moves, you and I move together. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Good." Harry took the mug. He drank his tea. The kitchen below the office produced faintly the smell of pumpkin and roast carrots that meant supper. The man, after a moment, said, "How are your friends?" "Hermione has been crying for 2 days because of Skeeter." "I will deal with Skeeter at the end of the month." "How?" "In a way she will not enjoy and which will not be traceable. Ron is dating Lavender Brown." "Of course he is." Harry, who had not laughed out loud in 5 days, laughed. The laugh was small and quick, and the man did not turn his head to see it, but the man heard it, and the part of the man that had once, on a snow-dusted morning in Prague, written "teach him to laugh" on the bottom of an internal list, marked the entry as complete and erased it from his list of standing assignments. He had several other assignments left. He was not done. He was, however, that evening very nearly pleased. He drank his tea. He looked in the small slip of mirror over the office sink, at the face of a man who had increasingly come to look like Bucky Barnes of Brooklyn, born in 1917, and who would, by spring, be entirely that man and very little of anyone else. Outside the window, the December dusk thickened over the Hogwarts grounds. In the gallery above the great hall, the impostor calling himself Moody was, at that moment, taking his next dose of pala juice from the flask in his pocket and looking down at a dance floor he intended, by June, to have manipulated into producing the only result that mattered. He was, in his head, very nearly pleased as well. Both of them, in the manner of men who are very nearly pleased, were wrong about how the next 6 months would go. He had, in the spring term, what Hermione called by then his rituals. He ran the lawn between 4:30 and 5 every morning, the metal arm tucked against his side under the long coat. He took breakfast at 6. He read the prophet with the cold patience of a man who knew that the prophet was lying about 10 things, and that the 10 lies, taken together, told a truer story than any one truth would have. He walked the perimeter of the castle at 7 in a clockwise direction and at 7:30 in counterclockwise. He had identified in the 3rd month the 3 points along the perimeter at which the wards thinned, and had Flitwick, who had become, in the course of the year, the man's closest staff confidant, strengthen them. He took lunch in the kitchen with the house elves, who had decided in October that the metal-armed man was acceptable, and who fed him a quantity of meat each day that he found, in the part of himself that remembered Belgium in 1944, slightly indecent. He drilled Harry every evening from 9 to 10. The drills had moved, by February, beyond the dragon doctrine and into a doctrine the man called underwater, because the second task was a fortnight off, and the man had reason to believe that an underwater operation was a thing Harry would need to know how to do. The man had not himself ever conducted an underwater operation in a freshwater lake. The man had conducted one in 1959 in a Croatian harbor, and one in 1962 in a flooded turbine room in Czechoslovakia. But the Croatian harbor and the Czechoslovak turbine room had not had merpeople in them, and had not had grindelows. The man had read up on both. He had developed a small list of contingencies. He had drilled Harry on the list in a swimming pool. The man had Flitwick produce in an unused dungeon classroom by the simple expedient of asking. And Flitwick, who had a deep and entirely operational love of doing things no charms professor had ever thought to do before, had produced a working pool of approximately Olympic dimensions, and had personally enchanted it to obey such variations in temperature, current, and visibility as the man requested for any given evening's exercise. By the 3rd week of January, Harry could swim the length of the pool underwater on a single breath, recover a small, heavy object from the bottom, and produce a protego against 3 different incoming pressures. By the 4th week, he had added to that repertoire the use of the bubblehead charm, which Hermione had taught him, and which the man had insisted Harry use only as a redundancy, because the man did not believe in single points of failure for any operation involving the absence of breathable air. The second task was approaching. The hostages had not yet been named. The man had, however, observed the staff timetables sufficiently to recognize what was coming, and on the 2nd Friday of January he sat Harry down in the caretaker's office and said, "It will be you. You will be a hostage." "What?" "They take a thing from each champion. The thing is taken from underwater. It is not a thing. It is a person. The person is the one each champion most cherishes." "Then who is?" The man looked at Harry. The man, who did not need to answer the question, did not. Harry, after a moment, said, "Oh, you will need to know what to do," said the man, "when you discover that the hostage is me. You will be unconscious. I will be unconscious in a controlled manner. The hostages are sedated, then placed in stasis. I will be in stasis. You will retrieve me. You will retrieve me first, before the other champions retrieve their hostages. You will surface with me. You will then refuse, as a matter of courtesy, to leave until the other champions have surfaced with theirs, but in a manner that does not endanger you or me. Is this understood? Yes. There is a small additional matter. Yes. I am not certain that the merpeople, having had me in their custody for an hour, will be inclined to release me peaceably. They will recognize in me something they do not have a category for. They may react badly. You will, in such an eventuality, need to be ready. Define ready. You will need to be ready to make distance, 17 meters minimum. You will make it with the wind charm we worked on in November. Yes. You will not panic. I will not panic. Good. They had drilled it, accordingly, for 3 more weeks. By the day of the second task, Harry could perform the entire operation in his sleep, which the man had also drilled him on, because the man had a deep skeptical respect for what happened to bodies in cold water, and an even deeper respect for what happened to plans. In the meantime, the impostor, calling himself Moody, continued his slow, patient work. The impostor had developed for the man, with the metal arm, a wary regard. The impostor had attempted, on 2 separate occasions in February, to maneuver Harry into circumstances the impostor could exploit, and had been foiled both times by the man's discreet adjustment of corridor patterns and patrol times. The impostor had begun to suspect that the metal-armed Muggle veteran was, in fact, something else. The impostor had not yet been able to confirm the suspicion, because every time he tried to confirm it, the metal-armed man slid sideways out of the line of inquiry, with the gentle, persistent evasion of a man who had been evading such inquiries since 1938. The impostor was patient. The man with the metal arm was, the impostor discovered, more patient. By the morning of the second task, they had reached a stable equilibrium of mutual surveillance. The impostor and the man with the metal arm passed each other in corridors. Neither of them looked at the other. Each of them mapped the other in peripheral vision. Each of them, by then, had a thick page of notes on the other in his own private file. Neither file had yet quite resolved into a final picture. The pictures, both of them, would resolve in the third task and not before. There was also, that spring, the matter of Rita Skeeter. Skeeter had been writing about Harry since the goblet drew his name, in the brittle, confidential prose she used when she had no facts and wished to suggest she had many. She had also been writing about the man with the metal arm, although in oblique form, because she had not yet quite established that the man with the metal arm existed in any verifiable sense. The editorial team at the Prophet had bounced back 2 of her drafts on the grounds that her sources for Potter's mysterious adoptive uncle were entirely circumstantial. Skeeter, who took such things as challenges, had been spending the early evenings near the castle perimeter in the form of a beetle. The man, who had identified the beetle in November and had identified what the beetle was in December, had been letting it run. He had decided, on the Friday of the last week of January, that the running was over. He arranged a small, clean meeting with the beetle on a Wednesday in February. The arrangement involved a cup of strawberry preserve, a jam jar, and a willingness to wait for 45 minutes in the corridor, outside the hospital wing, in the particular position that he had observed Skeeter favored when she was eavesdropping on Madame Pomfrey. He waited the 45 minutes. He caught the beetle in the jam jar at the moment it attempted to land on a fold of his coat. He screwed the lid on. He carried the jam jar back to the caretaker's office. He set it on the desk. He did not that evening do anything else to it. Hermione, who had also been investigating Skeeter, came to the office on the Thursday with a printout of 3 articles she had identified as Skeeter's worst, and was about to lay them on the desk when she saw the jam jar and stopped mid-step. "Is that it is? You caught her." "I caught her." "What are you going to do with her?" "I am going to ask her very politely to retire from journalism." "Will she?" "She will." She did. The man had a conversation with Skeeter on the Friday morning that was, by all accounts, brief, polite, and conducted entirely in the formal English Skeeter herself preferred. The terms of the conversation had not been made public, but Skeeter, the following Monday, filed a letter of resignation with the Prophet and took up residency. The public learned the week after, on a small island in the Hebrides where she had inherited a cottage. She did not return to journalism. She did not, in fact, return to the mainland for several years. The man, who had been a great many things in his life, but who had never been a man who took pleasure in unnecessary violence, had concluded the conversation without violence. He had concluded it instead with a quiet exposition of the consequences for Skeeter of continuing to write about Harry, and an even quieter exposition of the consequences for Skeeter of writing about the man. And Skeeter, who had been catching small fragments of the man's biography in her beetle form for months, had been by the end of his exposition persuaded. Hermione, when the news of Skeeter's resignation broke, said only, "What did you say to her?" "I told her where her sister lived." That's all, that's all. The implication was sufficient. Hermione, who was sharp and small and had read enough adult books, considered this answer carefully and then said, "I see. Thank you." The man nodded once and returned to his tea. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. Brooklyn comes calling. The morning of the second task came in white and cold. The lake had not frozen. Dumbledore had had Flitwick adjust the wards in the autumn to prevent the freezing, but mist had settled along the lower meadows in thick scarves, and the platforms by the shore were rimed with the kind of frost that climbed up the wood from the underside. The stands had filled by 9. The 4 champions in the tent at the water's edge stood in 4 small private postures of attention. Harry, who had been drilled until he could perform the task in his sleep, performed it in the alert and unhurried manner the man had instilled in him. The man, by then, was elsewhere. He had been taken from the caretaker's office at 1 in the morning, in a sedated and controlled fashion, by a quiet professor whose name was on no list of accomplices, and who had been recruited for the job by Dumbledore on the personal understanding that the professor would tell no one, ever, what he had done. The professor had escorted the sedated man, with the assistance of 2 of the more discreet ghosts, to the edge of the lake. From there the merpeople had taken delivery. They had placed the man in his stasis, in the small staked rope-tethered position they had used for hostages in previous tournaments, with 3 additional ropes the merpeople had insisted on because, while they had not been told what the man was, they had recognized in him on first contact a person who, even unconscious, was unlikely to behave like a hostage. They had also taken the precaution of stationing 2 of their warriors near him, with tridents drawn. The merpeople were sensible. Harry, when the cannon fired, went into the water. The lake was cold. The cold registered as it had registered in the dungeon pool, which was to say that he had been drilled on the cold and had been drilled, in particular, on the way his hands wanted to refuse the wand and on the way his breath wanted to come out short. He overrode both. He oriented. He cast the wind redirect that the man had taught him, which moved a column of slightly warmer water out from his chest in a thin tube 2 meters long and which made navigation, the man had explained, more efficient by reducing drag. He swam. He found the man within 19 minutes. He had been told by Hermione's reading to expect the merpeople village in the western bend of the lake, and he had been told by the man's reading to be alert for trapping channels in the rocks. He took the alert channels. He swam past 2 grindylows that registered him and decided, in the small algorithmic way of grindylows, not to engage. He found the hostage area at 23 minutes. He saw the man tethered in the standard hostage position. He saw the 2 merwarriors. He saw the 3rd merwarrior who had not been visible from the approach. He nodded once at the merwarriors. They did not nod back. He went to the man. The ropes around the man's chest were the kind of ropes the merpeople used for things they did not want released. Harry, who had been told that he would not be allowed to cut his hostage free without making the merpeople involved, took out his wand and addressed the lead warrior in the small, careful English of a boy who had been taught that politeness was a tactical instrument. "I have come for my hostage," he said. The wind tube around his chest carried the sound to the warrior with reasonable clarity. "He is the hostage of the champion. I have a right to take him." The lead warrior, who had been studying Harry with the steady carnivorous attention of a creature for whom a champion was, on balance, food, considered the politeness and the wand and the tube of warmer water around the boy's chest. The lead warrior gestured with the trident in a manner Harry took for acknowledgement. Harry cut the first rope. The merpeople did not move. He cut the second. They still did not move. He cut the third. It was on the third rope that the man's pulse, which the merpeople had suppressed for the duration of the stasis, came back. The man's pulse came back at the standard rate Harry had measured on his own with his small medical kit in Brasov, which had been 52 beats a minute at rest. It came back, however, in a body that had been held under cold lake water for 9 hours in stasis, and the body, on receiving the pulse, did the thing a body of its training had been built to do, which was to open the eyes and assess the threat environment. The threat environment was 3 merwarriors with tridents in close formation around the body's primary protected asset. The man, who had not been entirely briefed on the precise nature of the second task before he had been put to sleep, did the thing he had been trained to do when he woke in unfamiliar restraints in proximity to weapons. He broke the remaining tether by the simple expedient of contracting the metal arm against the rope, which severed the rope, and then, in the follow-through, the wooden stake the rope had been attached to. He pivoted. The metal arm reached for the trident of the warrior to his left. He had it in his hand before the warrior had recognized that the prisoner had moved. Harry, who had drilled for exactly this moment with the man for 3 weeks, did the wind charm at exactly the right moment. The wind charm produced a sudden displaced column of cold water that pushed the 3 merwarriors back 2 meters, which was not 17 but which was enough. Harry took the man's wrist. Harry kicked, hard, toward the surface. They surfaced 30 seconds later in the cold, thin air. The stands cheered. The man, treading water with the metal arm and breathing in the careful sequential way the man had drilled himself to breathe after stasis, said into Harry's ear in a voice the stands could not hear, "Threat. Behind, 8 meters 3. They will not pursue. They cannot leave the water. You did well. You taught me. You did it. We will discuss the merpeople later." They swam to the platform. They climbed out. Madame Pomfrey, who had been waiting on the platform with 2 warmed blankets and a quantity of pepper-up potion in a small flask, draped 1 blanket around Harry and 1 around the man, and pressed the flask first into the man's hand. The man, who had been awake on a freezing lake for under 5 minutes, drank the potion and did not appear to require a second dose. He passed the flask to Harry. Harry drank. The other champions surfaced over the next 9 minutes, each with their own hostage. The judges scored. The man on the platform was the only hostage of the 4 who was not asleep. The merpeople, when they sent up their chieftainess to deliver her formal report to Dumbledore, recommended that the metal-armed man not be invited back into the lake in any future capacity. Dumbledore, who had not previously had occasion to negotiate diplomatic terms with the merpeople over a guest, agreed. Harry came in first. He had been first into the hostage area, first to surface, and within the boundary of the time limit. The judges, accordingly, gave him the highest marks of the day, although Karkaroff scored him a 4 out of 10 on the principle that Karkaroff had decided by then to be obstructive. The man on the platform registered the 4 out of 10 and added Karkaroff to a small list in his head that he had been calling in the privacy of his thoughts afterward. Karkaroff did not at the time know the list existed. He would, in the fullness of time, learn. They walked back to the castle together. Harry was tired. The man, who had been in stasis for 9 hours, was tired in a different way. They walked the long, sloped path up from the lake at the steady, patient pace of two people who had nowhere to be for the next hour. At the courtyard, the man paused. The man turned his head. He looked at the postern gate at the far end of the courtyard. "What is it?" said Harry. "There is someone at the postern gate." "Hagrid." "Number." The man walked the diagonal across the courtyard to the postern. The postern was a small side door in the curtain wall that gave on the Hogsmeade Road. The man, on reaching it, did not open it. The man laid the flesh hand against the wood and listened. The someone on the other side of the postern was breathing. The someone on the other side of the postern had not, by then, decided whether to knock. The someone on the other side of the postern had been walking for 2 days from the village down the road, and had been, before that, walking for 3 years across Europe, and the someone on the other side of the postern had, in the particular taut, hopeful posture of a man who had refused to give up, laid his own hand on the same wood from the other side, and had been waiting. The man, who had been on the other side of this particular postern for 50 years, opened the door. Steve Rogers stood in the road. He was wearing a brown jacket that had seen a great deal of weather, and a soft cap, and a pair of boots that had been resoled twice that decade. He was not in his uniform. He had not in 3 years been in his uniform. He had been a traveler, a tracker, a man who had spent every dollar of his accumulated back pay on the slow, patient work of following a ghost across the eastern half of a continent. And he had, 11 months ago, in a burned-out Hydra cell outside Sevastopol, found the first piece of evidence he could not explain except by the conclusion that the ghost he had been following had stopped being a ghost. He had refined the conclusion across the 11 months. He had refined it in libraries in Riga and in graveyards in Brasov and in old archives in Krakow. He had refined it, finally, 2 weeks ago, when Sam Wilson, who had been with him in Brooklyn for a year before they had set out, had picked up, in a small bookshop in Glasgow, a paperback copy of a book about a boy wizard, on the cover of which was a small sketch of the boy, and beside the boy was a small detail Sam had identified, with the practical eye of a man who had once been a pararescueman, as a metal arm. Sam, who had spent the past year tracking the ghost with Steve and had developed for the ghost a wary professional patience, had set the book down, paid for it, and said, "Steve, he's in England." They had come down the previous afternoon. They had taken rooms at a small inn in the village. They had walked up the road this morning at first light. They had been standing at the postern for 40 minutes. Steve, when the postern opened, did not say anything for the first 5 seconds. Steve looked. Steve's eyes were the eyes of a man who had been seeing a thing in his head for 43 years, and was now seeing it in the road in front of him, and he was, in that moment, doing the small difficult work of bridging the gap between the head and the road. The man with the metal arm did not say anything either. The man with the metal arm did the small adjustment of his face that was, by then, his most thorough version of a greeting. "Bucky," said Steve. "Punk," said Bucky. The word came up out of him from somewhere very deep. It was not a word he had spoken in 50 years. It came out as easily as Malinky had come on the first night in the cupboard when the body had remembered what the head had not. Steve cried then, briefly, in the manner Steve had cried in the trenches in 1944 and in the field hospital in 1943 and in his mother's kitchen in 1928, which was without sound and without changing his stance. Bucky permitted him to cross the threshold. Steve stepped into the courtyard. The postern closed behind him. Harry, who had been standing 4 meters back, observed all of this without intervening. Harry, when Bucky looked back over his shoulder, came forward. "Harry," said Bucky, "this is Steve. He is an old friend. He is, in fact, the oldest friend I have. Steve, this is Harry. He is—" Bucky paused. Bucky considered his vocabulary. Bucky chose, with the careful precision he chose his vocabulary, the most accurate word. "My son." Harry, who had not been called Bucky's son in any direct sentence by Bucky until that moment, took the word the way he had taken the broom on the day of the first task, without comment, with the recognition of a thing that had always been so and that someone had now bothered to say. He held out his hand to Steve. Steve, who had taken the hand of presidents and shaken the hand of generals, and once held the hand of Margaret Carter in a London hospital while she did not let go, took the small hand of the small, thin boy in the wet robe with the careful courtesy of a man who had recognized, in the small, thin boy, the next generation of the only family he had. "Hello, sir," said Harry. "Hello, Harry," said Steve. They went up to the castle. Sam Wilson, who had been waiting at the end of the road, came up after them by prior arrangement and met them in the courtyard. Sam, who had been told what the schools at Hogwarts taught and had not yet decided whether to believe it, shook Bucky's flesh hand and Harry's small hand and turned to Steve and said, "We need to talk." They had 3 hours of talking. They had it in a private parlor off the headmaster's office, with Dumbledore present and McGonagall present and Flitwick present. They had it in the slow, circling way that men with shared history talk when there is too much to say and too little time to say it in. Steve, who had been preparing his half of the conversation for 3 years, asked his questions in order. Bucky answered them in order. Harry, who had been told he could stay or could leave, stayed. What Steve had wanted, the man understood, was a single sentence that explained the previous 50 years. The man could not give him that sentence. What the man gave him instead was the smaller true sentence of the past 7 years, which was that on a Friday afternoon in October 1984, a 4-year-old boy in a cupboard in Surrey had wanted with his whole small self for a hand to let go of his wrist. And a thing had broken in Hampstead, and the man had woken up, and the man's mission had rewritten itself. And the man had been, in the slow, careful 7-year repair work that followed, putting himself back together with the boy as the load-bearing center of the rebuilt structure. Steve, listening, did not interrupt. Steve, listening, watched Harry as the man told it. Steve, who had not been a tactician for nothing in 1944, understood by the end of the second hour what had happened. The thing that had failed in Bucky was the thing that had been put in him by Hydra, and the thing that had replaced it was a child. The replacement had been clean. The replacement was, in Steve's professional opinion, the most successful deprogramming he had ever heard of, and it had not been done by any of the institutions Steve had been considering as candidates for the work. It had been done, slowly, by a small, thin boy with green eyes who had said hello in a cupboard. Steve, at the end of the 3rd hour, said, "I came to bring you home, Buck." "I know. Not coming. I am home. He is. I see that. Will you stay?" Steve looked at Sam. Sam, who had been listening with the patient, attentive face he kept for serious conversations, said, "We can stay. We can stay as long as needed. Steve and I have been talking about what after looks like. After looks like whatever you need it to look like, Buck. We'll work it out." Bucky, who had not been called Buck by anyone but Steve in 50 years, registered the word. He nodded once. "Stay," he said, "both of you. I will need you in June." Steve, who had not asked what was in June, did not ask. Steve had developed across the long years of their friendship the habit of waiting until Bucky was ready to explain, and Bucky was, at that moment, not ready. Bucky would be ready in his own time before June. In the meantime, there were 2 months of school left, and the 3rd task was at the end of those 2 months, and the man calling himself Moody had not yet, in any operationally visible way, made his move. He made it on the 18th of June. The third task was a maze grown on the Quidditch pitch by Hagrid and Sprout. The maze was full of obstacles, some of them dangerous, some of them merely strange, and at the center of the maze was the Triwizard Cup. The champion who reached the cup first would win. The champions entered the maze in order of standing. Harry, who was tied for first with Cedric Diggory, entered with him. Steve and Sam, who had been resident at the castle for 4 months, were stationed by Bucky's arrangement. Steve at the southern entrance to the maze, where the dragons in the Lake of the Cold Corner were grouped, and Sam at the northern entrance, where the access for emergency egress had been built. Bucky himself was inside the maze. He had been smuggled in at 3 in the morning by the same quiet professor who had taken him to the lake in February, and had been placed in a particular position at the second junction by the trapdoor in the southwest quadrant. He had a small folding stool with him. He had a flask of black coffee. He had a sightline through a small adjustment in the hedge that he had personally made the previous evening, which gave him a view of the central plinth on which the cup stood. He intended to be near, but not at, the cup at the moment Harry reached it. The maze took, for Harry, an hour and 20 minutes. He met Cedric 4 times. He met an acromantula once, which he handled with the magic and a useful piece of footwork from the man's small team doctrine. He met a sphinx, who asked him a riddle, which he answered in the careful Latin Hermione had drilled into him over the autumn. He met, finally, near the center, Cedric, who had been struck by a confundus from Crumb at a previous junction, and was wandering, dazed, in the rough direction of the cup. Harry took Cedric by the arm. He guided Cedric out of the confundus with a small counter-charm. He explained to Cedric, in 3 sentences, the position. Cedric, who was honorable and tired and bleeding lightly from a cut on his forehead, said, "Together." Harry hesitated. Harry, for 1 second, considered the man's doctrine and what it had said about shared objectives. The man's doctrine had said that shared objectives between 2 principals in a contested environment were workable only if both principals trusted the same authority. Harry trusted the man. He did not, with the same depth, trust Cedric, but Cedric, who was honorable and tired and bleeding lightly, was not a threat. Harry, after 1 second, agreed. They walked to the plinth together. They reached the cup at the same instant. They reached for it at the same instant. Bucky, in his position behind the second junction, did the small calculation he had been running for 40 minutes. He had been watching the boys approach. He had identified Cedric as a non-hostile and as a person Harry, against all the man's prior preferences, had decided to bring along. The man, on identifying this, had revised his contingency 3 times. He had revised it for the final time at the moment Harry's hand touched the cup. The man rose from his stool. The man stepped through the hedge with the cold efficiency he had used to step through doors in his previous life. The man arrived at the plinth in 11 seconds. The cup, when Harry and Cedric touched it, was, the man had known for 6 weeks, a portkey. He had known this because the impostor calling himself Moody had spent the previous Friday evening in the gardens with the cup in his hands at the precise hour the impostor had arranged for the gardens to be empty. And the man with the metal arm, who had not, in that hour, been in his room as the impostor had supposed, but had been in the small dovecote above the gardens with a pair of binoculars, had observed the work. The man had not interrupted. He had decided that Friday evening that the portkey would be the moment of greatest leverage. He had decided to allow the portkey to fire. He had decided to be on the portkey when it did. He was. The metal hand closed on Harry's collar. The flesh hand closed on Cedric's collar. The cup yanked them, all 4 of them, boy, man, and cup, across the field of magnetic intent that constituted a portkey. And they came down, 3 seconds later, in long grass in a graveyard that smelled of damp stone and of something the man recognized, very faintly, as iron filings and decay. The graveyard was Little Hangleton. The man, on arriving, did the assessment in 2 seconds. Low stone wall, 3 sightlines, a yew tree, an open stone basin, a small thin man approaching with a bundle. The bundle was, the man understood, a person reduced to whatever was now contained in the bundle, and the small thin man was Peter Pettigrew, whose name the man had learned in the previous summer from the Daily Prophet, but whose face he had not until now seen. Cedric, who had not been briefed for any of this, raised his wand. The man with the metal arm beside him said quietly, "Stand behind us. Do not engage. You are not part of the operation." Cedric, who recognized command voice when he heard it and was honorable enough to obey, stood behind them. The man took Harry's free hand. The man steadied it. The man said in the low, careful English Harry had heard at the second junction of the maze drills, "We are now in the wrong field. We are going to fight it. You will follow my count. Do you understand?" "Yes," said Harry. "On 3. But the small, thin man with the bundle had, in the moment that the 4 of them had landed, already begun to chant. In the weeks between the second task and the third, the rhythm of life in the castle adjusted itself around the presence of 2 large American men in civilian dress at the staff table. Steve, who had been given the courtesy title of Mr. Rogers, and a small set of rooms in the East Wing, took to walking the perimeter with Bucky in the mornings. He had been in 1944 a boy from Brooklyn who had wanted to do the right thing about Hitler. He was, in 1995, a man from Brooklyn who had been frozen and thawed and frozen again, and was now, in a Scottish castle full of magicians, learning the maps of corridors and the patterns of patrol rotations from the friend he had spent half a century looking for. He learned the maps quickly. He learned the patterns more quickly. He did not, in the 4 months he stayed, miss a single shift. Sam, who had been given rooms beside Steve's, took a different approach. He had decided, on the first morning, that the surest way to make himself useful to a place run by professors who had no idea what to do with him was to befriend the students. He spent the mornings with the defense classes, helping Flitwick with practical drills. He spent the afternoons with Hagrid, who had, after his initial worry that Sam would be alarmed by the creatures, discovered that Sam was alarmed by almost nothing, and had begun to introduce him to the more interesting of the school's resident magical fauna. By April, Sam had names for 3 of the Thestrals and a working understanding of the etiquette of greeting a centaur. By May, the Gryffindor 4th years had, in collective vote, made Sam the unofficial defense tutor of the year, and Sam, who had been a pararescueman in another life and had taught more frightened young people than he could count, had taken the role with the steady humor that was the public layer of his soul. Bucky permitted it. Bucky had decided, in the first week of Steve and Sam's residency, that the operational benefit of having 2 old friends in the castle outweighed the operational risk of breaking his 50-year habit of working alone. He had explained this to Steve over a pot of coffee one morning in early March, in the small parlor off the caretaker's office. Steve, who had been waiting for the explanation, had taken it with the patient face he had been wearing for 50 years. "I have a son now," Bucky had said. "He is the operation. The operation will go better with you in it. I am asking." "You're asking," Steve had said. "Buck, you don't have to ask. I am asking." "Then I'm staying, Sam's staying, we're both staying." "Good, there are rules." "Tell me the rules." Bucky told him the rules. They were the rules he had developed over 7 years of operating alone with a child as his protected asset. They had been written, in the small black notebook, in his careful clipped handwriting. Steve, who had not been operating with anyone in 3 years and had become rusty at the discipline of being a subordinate in another man's operation, took the rules with the seriousness of a man who had recognized, in the rules, the structure that had kept his oldest friend alive across the rebuild. He memorized them in 3 days. He did not deviate from any of them, ever. Sam memorized them in 2 days. Sam, who had been a junior to Steve in another team in another life, was good at this work. By the end of April, Bucky, Steve, and Sam were operating as a small, disciplined three-person unit, with the centerpiece being a 14-year-old wizard. By the middle of May, they had identified, jointly, the imposter in the defense post as the operational threat, had identified the third-floor wing as the imposter's working corridor, and had compiled a 30-page brief on the imposter's habits, contacts outside the castle, and likely operational schedule. They had not engaged. They had not engaged because Bucky had decided that engagement before the third task would compromise the long game, and Steve and Sam, who deferred in this operation to Bucky's judgment, had not engaged either. By the morning of the third task, they were ready in the way professionals are ready, which is to say that they had each rehearsed their parts and had each, privately in the small hours of the morning, walked through the scenarios in which their parts would not be enough. Sam, at the northern entrance to the maze, had rehearsed 3 variations on the egress contingency. Steve, at the southern entrance, had rehearsed 2 variations on the south side perimeter break. Bucky, on his small folding stool by the second junction, had rehearsed, with the patient comprehensive care he gave to all such things, 17 variations on the moment when the cup would prove to be what he had spent 6 weeks believing it would prove to be. He had rehearsed the variations in order. He had assigned probabilities. He had ranked by probability and by consequence the 17. He had selected the top 3 for primary contingency. He had selected the 4th for backup. He had not, in the rehearsal, allowed himself to think about the moment after the portkey fired, because the moment after the portkey fired was an unknown environment, and the man had learned long ago that rehearsing unknown environments produced overconfidence in known plans. He had, however, made one small private addition to the operation that he had not shared with Steve or with Sam. He had, in the inside pocket of his coat, the small box of pure silver bullets he had purchased in Diagon Alley 4 years previously. He had been carrying them by habit since. He had loaded 6 of them, 2 days before the third task, into the small revolver he kept in his sock. He had not in 7 years had occasion to fire silver. He had a suspicion he was about to. There were, in those final weeks before the third task, also smaller pieces. Harry's friends were briefed in pieces. Hermione, who had been making her own observations of the imposter across the spring and had assembled in her small precise notes an analysis that paralleled the man's, was given a redacted summary by Bucky on the second Friday of May. She read it. She added 2 facts of her own. Bucky added the facts to his brief. Ron, who had been afraid for Harry since the goblet had drawn his name, and who had been keeping his own quiet vigil along the corridors, was given the same summary the same evening by Harry. He read it more slowly than Hermione. He understood it more slowly. He arrived at the same conclusion in twice the time and was, on arriving, fully committed. Bucky, who had been observing Ron since September, had decided some weeks before that the red-headed boy was a thing that, in the operational shorthand of his own profession, he would have called reliable second knife. Ron, when he learned of the assessment from Harry on the way to dinner the same evening, did not entirely know what it meant. He took the meaning, however, from the way Harry said it, and he took it as a compliment, and he treated it as such for the rest of his life. Steve, who was good at the slower work of conversation, spent the 4 months between his arrival and the third task speaking to Harry. He spoke to him at breakfast. He spoke to him during the morning walks. He spoke to him about Brooklyn, the Brooklyn of 1928, which had had streetcars and pushcarts and certain other features the boy had never seen. And he spoke to him about the war, in the careful selective way Steve had developed for speaking about the war. And he spoke to him, occasionally, about Bucky. The Bucky he spoke about was the Bucky of 1932 and 1938 and 1944, who had been a young man with a sharp wit and a kind temper, and a way of laughing at funerals that Steve, even now, could not bring himself to disapprove of. Harry, who had not until then had a vocabulary for the man's other lives, listened. He filed the vocabulary away. He used it occasionally in private to test how the man's face moved when the man heard pieces of his own former life. The man's face, on hearing it, moved in small ways the man did not appear to notice himself. Harry, watching, noticed for him. Sam, who had taken on Harry the way an older cousin takes on a younger, taught Harry, over the same months, the small civilian things the man had not taught him because the man had not had occasion to. Sam taught Harry to throw a baseball. He taught him to play backgammon. He taught him a particular blues guitar progression on Sam's old travel guitar that Harry, who had not played any instrument since the recorder, learned across 3 evenings. Sam taught him, in the small, unsystematic way of a man who taught the way other people breathed, about a great many other things: Mississippi, jazz, the particular grammar of the South Side of Chicago, the social etiquette of a small black church in Harlem in 1953, which Sam had heard about from his grandmother, and Harry, who had been raised by a Brooklyn-born ex-Soviet asset who had been making up for 50 lost years one cultural lacuna at a time, was unreasonably grateful for the additional instruction. By the last week of May, Harry was a different boy from the one who had stepped onto platform 9 3/4 at 11. He still had the careful diction. He still had the steady, evaluative gaze. He still had, and would always have, the small particular discipline of a child who had been raised in safe houses. But he had, in addition, the easier shoulders of a boy who had been spoken to often by adults who liked him. He had the small, dry humor that Sam had cultivated in him. He had the broader vocabulary of pre-war Brooklyn that Steve had supplied. And he had, in his bearing, the unforced confidence of a child who was loved by 3 men who would, if it became necessary, take a continent apart to keep him alive. He did not, in those weeks, know any of this consciously. He felt it as warmth. Chapter 5 End. Chapter 6. A vibranium wind in Little Hangleton, the graveyard, was an old one. It had been an old one in 1943, when the boy who would later call himself Lord Voldemort had crossed it on the night of the murder of his father, and the half-century that had passed since had not done much to make it less so. The yew tree at its center had been there for 400 years. The headstones were tilted and lichened. The grass was the long, thin grass of an unmown country churchyard at midsummer, the kind that brushes a man's shins as he walks and makes a sound that is not quite hiss and not quite whisper. In the long grass, the small, thin man with the bundle had been chanting since the moment of arrival. The man with the metal arm had heard the first 3 words of the chant and had recognized, from a fragment in the Russian wizard's treatise he had purchased 4 years previously, the general direction of the working. He had calculated in the second after the recognition how long the working would take. He had calculated in the second after that how long it would take him to do what was now necessary. The 2 figures took the same length of time. He could not stop the working. He could, however, prepare for the figure that the working produced. He moved. He moved the way he moved when an operation had crossed from its planned phase into its improvised phase, which is to say at a speed his planning had not anticipated and which his body knew. He took Cedric Diggory by the collar in the metal hand. He lifted Cedric off his feet. He set Cedric in 2 long strides behind the bole of the yew tree in the only piece of dead ground the graveyard offered. He said in Cedric's ear in clipped clear English, "Stay. Move only if I tell you. If I do not tell you in 5 minutes, take the cup, which will fire as a portkey if held with the will. Take it back. Tell Dumbledore where we are." He left Cedric in the dead ground. He came back across the grass to Harry. Harry was already moving. Harry had drawn his wand on the count of 1, before Bucky had finished saying 3, and Harry was already in the small brace stance the man had been drilling into him for 7 years. The man fell into the complementary stance to Harry's right. The two of them, on the open grass in front of the headstone of Tom Riddle Sr., made a small fixed pair, a 14-year-old wizard with a holly wand and a 78-year-old soldier with a vibranium arm. The small thin man with the bundle finished his chant. What rose out of the cauldron the small thin man had set in the long grass was not, when it rose, immediately a person. It was a long pale shape with arms and legs that needed for a few seconds to be coaxed into the geometry of a body. It found the geometry. It stepped, naked and reed-like, out of the cauldron into the grass. It was thin and white and snake-faced and bald, and its eyes were red, and its mouth, when it opened it, was the mouth of a thing that did not need a tongue to speak with. It spoke. It said, in the imperious sibilant cadence of a man who had been waiting 13 years to be heard, "Robe me." The small thin man, Pettigrew, robed it. The thing took the robe. The thing flexed its long, thin fingers. The thing looked with the slow, languid attention of a creature that had until that moment been busy being undead at the two figures by the yew tree. The thing said, "Harry Potter." Harry, who had drilled for fights with armed adults since he was 6 and who had drilled in particular for fights in which the adult was attempting to be theatrical, did not answer. The man beside him did not answer. The thing said, "And what is this with you, Harry Potter?" "This," said Harry, "is my father." The thing's eyes narrowed. It said nothing for a second. It did, in the second, what intelligent things do when faced with a category they do not have. It adjusted. It said in a voice still sibilant but now also speculative, "I had not heard." "There are a number of things," said Harry, "you have not heard." The thing smiled. It was not a smile a face was designed to produce. It said, "We shall see," and raised its wand. It cast. The casting was a wide arc of green light that came up out of the wand the way a thrown sheet of phosphorescent water comes off a knife, and it traveled across the grass at the speed of a thrown thing. And the man with the metal arm, who had spent 40 seconds watching the chant and another 20 seconds estimating the wandarm's mechanics, knew, with the small clinical certainty he gave such things, the trajectory of the casting before it left the wand. He stepped in front of Harry. The metal arm came up. The green light met the metal hand. It did not pass through. It did not bounce. It did not, in any direction Voldemort had ever cast it before, behave. The killing curse, in 50 years of operational use, had performed the same function in every encounter the wraith on the back of Quirrell's head had ever had with it. It had killed. It had killed people. It had killed creatures. It had killed, briefly, on a celebrated occasion in the autumn of 1981, a married couple. It had killed, briefly, on the same occasion, a baby, although the baby, that night, had not stayed killed for reasons the casting wizard had been refining theories about for 13 years. It did not kill metal. The metal in the man's hand had not been made by people who understood the killing curse. The metal in the man's hand had been forged in the mound of Wakanda by men who understood different kinds of energy entirely, and the metal absorbed the green light the way it absorbed every other kind of energy that had been thrown at it across the decades since the man's metal arm had been built. It absorbed it. It hummed, very softly, with the small additional charge. It did not pass it. The man's flesh arm, which was the rest of his body, was unharmed. The man's metal arm, on which the green light had landed, was holding the green light like a small extra weight, which the man could, by a flex of the metal hand, redirect into the ground. He redirected it. The grass beneath the metal hand turned black at the roots. The blade itself remained, somehow, green. Voldemort stared. The thing on the wraith's face had not seen this before. The thing in the wraith had not, in 13 years of undead theorizing, considered the possibility that there existed in the world a kind of matter the killing curse did not touch. The man, while Voldemort stared, did the small operational thing he had been preparing to do for 2 minutes. He took the small revolver from his sock. He cocked it. He held it in the flesh hand, low and unobtrusive, with the muzzle pointing at the grass. Voldemort recovered. Voldemort, who had a long memory for surprises and an even longer one for the lesson that surprises did not, in their substance, change the structure of a duel, raised his wand again. He said, in the soft, considered way of a teacher addressing a problem set, Avada Kedavra, and cast a second time. The man redirected the second curse the way he had redirected the first. The grass turned black in a second small patch. "Death Eaters," said Voldemort into the air. "Attend me." They apparated in. They came in with the precise theatricality of a group that had been rehearsing this entrance for 13 years. They came in their black robes and their silver masks and their high formal cloaks. They came in 11 of them. They formed around the open patch of grass, a circle in which Harry, the man, the cauldron, Pettigrew, and Voldemort stood at the center. They had wands drawn. They were, in operational terms, 11 trained wizards arrayed in a tactical encirclement of a 14-year-old, an unknown variable in dark clothes, and their master. The man with the metal arm did not regard the encirclement. The man with the metal arm did, however, register the small breeze that had come up from the south. The small breeze had not been there a moment before. The small breeze had the particular dry warmth of an evening updraft, but it was not an evening, and the updraft was not natural. And the man, who had spent 8 months in the previous decade developing, with a Wackened engineer he had met once in Helsinki and would never see again, a set of small auxiliary functions for the metal arm that he had not yet had occasion to use in the field, recognized in the breeze the small targeted disturbance pattern that was, by long arrangement with Sam, Sam's signal that he had arrived. Sam had arrived. The man understood because Cedric had taken the cup back. Cedric had taken it back. Dumbledore had received the message. The portkey had been reverse-engineered. Steve and Sam, who had been on standby for the entire duration of the task, had used the same portkey at the south entrance to get themselves into the graveyard. They were both, the man calculated, somewhere along the southern wall of the churchyard, behind the dry stone field boundary. The man, in the second after registering the breeze, made a small calculation about the 11 Death Eaters. He arrayed them in his head. He assigned each of them a number from 1 to 11 by order of threat. He assigned each of them in his head a method. He looked at Harry. He said, in the low, careful English Harry had heard at the second junction, 3, 2, 1, he moved. He moved with the speed he had once been the only thing in living memory capable of. He moved with the speed Steve had spent 4 months relearning. He went at Death Eater number 2, the largest, with the heaviest robe, who he had assessed as the most overconfident, at a diagonal that took him out of Voldemort's primary firing solution. He went at number 2 with the metal arm low and the flesh arm holding the revolver. He fired 1 silver bullet. The bullet went through number 2's mask and through the wand arm just below the shoulder. The wand fell out of the hand. The man in the follow-through broke number 2's neck with the metal hand. Number 2 fell. The man had been moving for 1.5 seconds. Harry, on the other side of the open ground, was also moving. He had registered the man's count. He had registered behind the count the entire body of doctrine the man had been teaching him for 7 years. He cast the wind redirect to his immediate left, which moved Death Eater number 7's wand arm 2 meters off axis from the angle number 7 had intended, and number 7's curse went into the cauldron rather than into Harry. He drew his small folding knife from his sleeve with the same hand that had been holding the wand a quarter second before, and threw it. The knife went into number 7's wand hand at the wrist. The wand fell. Number 7 shouted. The encirclement, which had been built on the assumption that the central targets would be slow, broke. It broke first along the southern arc. Steve came over the dry stone wall at the height of the walls 2 meters with the careful economy of a man who had been waiting 4 months to use the part of himself that had once been a soldier. He had a shield. The shield was the original shield, the one he had not carried in 3 years, and he had brought it down through the long Eastern European search out of habit more than intent, and he had decided on the previous evening in his small room at Hogwarts that he would carry it tonight if Bucky would not laugh at him for it. Bucky had not laughed. Bucky had said only, "Bring it." Steve had brought it. The shield came over the wall first, then Steve, who landed in the long grass at a controlled tuck and rose into the run with the long shape of his body, finding its old gait inside 3 strides. He went at Death Eater number 5. The shield on Steve's left arm took number 5's curse on the boss and dispersed it sideways, the way the shield had dispersed every projectile thrown at it for 50 years. The shield's edge, in Steve's follow-through, took number 5 across the temple at the velocity of a thrown axe. Number 5 fell. Steve was now in the circle with the man and Harry, and the circle was no longer 11. Sam came in from the north. Sam, who did not have a shield and did not have Steve's strength, had a tactical eye that Steve had been trusting since the first day they had met in Brooklyn. Sam had come over the north wall with a clean line of sight on the southern half of the circle. He had a sidearm. He fired 3 rounds at Death Eater number 9, the second of which entered the small gap between number 9's mask and number 9's collar, and dropped number 9 before number 9 had recognized that the third member of the variable had arrived. He fired 3 more at number 10, who had been turning, and number 10 went down at the second shot. He moved across the grass at a low, controlled run. The encirclement, in 5 seconds, had gone from 11 to 7. Voldemort, in the center, who had spent 13 years preparing for the duel he had assumed would be the central event of the evening, recognized that the duel was no longer the central event. The central event had become the methodical clearing of his inner circle by what he had taken, in the first second of their arrival, to be 2 soldiers and a metal arm. He raised his wand at the metal arm. He cast. The metal arm caught the third killing curse the way it had caught the first 2. The man, who had now built up a useful charge in the vibranium plates, did the small precision motion he had been developing in the small hours of the last 6 weeks. He reversed the polarity of the absorbed energy and pushed it back the way it had come, in a thin lance of green light that traveled from the metal palm across the open grass and into the chest of one of the remaining Death Eaters, who had been standing to Voldemort's left and who, in the small clinical moment of being struck by his own master's killing curse delivered by a vibranium prosthetic, did the thing the curse made things do, which was die. Voldemort, who had now lost 5 of his 11, and who had not yet had the opportunity to engage Harry Potter at the level he had been planning for 13 years, recognized that the operational situation was no longer recoverable. He had 3 responses available. The first was to flee. The second was to take Harry as a hostage. The third was to finish the duel before the duel was rendered unavailable to him by the further losses he was about to take. He chose the third. He chose it because he was a man who had decided 13 years before that he would die rather than retreat from a 14-year-old in a graveyard. He raised his wand at Harry. He said, "Avada Kedavra." He cast the curse, the 4th and most carefully aimed of the evening, at the center of Harry's chest. Harry, who had been waiting for the curse for 3 breaths, did the thing he and the man had been working on across the spring. He cast Expelliarmus. He cast it in the precise window the man had drilled him on, which was the half-second in which a wand arm was committed to a casting and could not be redirected. The two beams of light met in the air between them. The beams locked. A small, clean dome of golden light rose around them, and inside the dome the locked beams thrummed. Inside the dome, the rules of the world adjusted themselves. The beam that was Voldemort's wanted on principle to reach Harry. The beam that was Harry's wanted, with the wide, patient want of a boy who had been raised by a man who taught everything as a field skill, to reach Voldemort's wand. The beams in equilibrium did neither. The beams trembled. Voldemort, on the far end of his beam, allowed his face to flicker with surprise. The man, who had been moving across the grass while the dome formed, was now 4 steps from Voldemort. He had cleared 2 more Death Eaters in the moves it had taken to cross. He had 3 to his right and 1 to his left. He did not consider them. He considered the wand hand in front of him. He took it. He took it in the metal hand. With the small, economical motion he had used to take the trident from the Merweir in the lake in February. The wand was still firing into the dome. The wand hand was still attached to Voldemort's arm. The metal hand closed around the wand hand. It closed slowly. It closed with the deliberate, slow strength of a vice being turned by a man who had decided that this particular vice was going to do this particular work and would not stop. Voldemort, who had been making a noise that was not entirely a scream, made a different noise. The wand arm broke. The wand fell out of the wand hand. The dome of golden light collapsed. Harry's Expelliarmus, freed from the lock, reached its proper destination, which was now the broken wrist on the end of the broken arm, and the wand, which had been arcing toward the long grass, was redirected by the disarming charm into Harry's left hand. Harry held the wand. He held his own wand in the right hand. He held Voldemort's wand in the left. He held them for 1 breath. He raised the right wand. He cast Reducto at the left wand. The left wand, which was a thin wand of yew with a phoenix feather core that was the sibling of Harry's own, did what wands did when struck at the median by a precise Reducto from a wand of the same core. It disintegrated. The phoenix feathers, freed, drifted in the warm air. Voldemort, in the metal hand, made a final attempt. The attempt was wandless. The attempt was the kind of wandless magic only the most powerful of dark wizards could produce, and it was, at the level Voldemort had reached, very dangerous indeed, but it was no longer dangerous to a man with a vibranium hand at his throat. The man closed the metal hand. The metal hand was, in the moment of closing, charged with the residual energy of 3 absorbed killing curses. The energy of the broken wand arm, the energy of the Reducto, and the small additional energy of 50 years of patience. The man closed the hand. What was on the back of the wraith's body, which had been, for 13 years, the last unkilled fragment of a man who had been making himself harder and harder to kill for 60 years, did the small final thing that fragments of unkilled wraith do, when the last vessel they have available to inhabit has had its neck closed by vibranium charged with 3 killing curses. It went out. It went out the way a fire goes out when its fuel is finally removed. It went out with no sound. The Death Eaters who remained, those who had not been cleared by Steve or Sam or by the man in the 4 seconds of clearing, broke. They apparated away in the disordered, staggered fashion of men whose master had not survived the duel he had ordered. The graveyard in the seconds after they left was very quiet. The man let go of the body. The body folded into the grass. It folded the way bodies do that have been held vertical by something inside them which has now been removed. The man stepped back from it. He looked at it. He did not, in the looking, allow himself any emotion that the operation had not required. He turned toward Harry. Harry was standing in the long grass with the holly wand still in his right hand. The phoenix feathers from the broken wand were drifting in the air around his head. His face was very still. The man crossed the grass to him in 3 strides. He knelt at Harry's eye level the way he had knelt in the cupboard in Privet Drive 11 years before. He took Harry's small face in the flesh hand. He looked at Harry. He said very quietly, "Are you hurt?" "Number anywhere." "Number good." He stood up. Steve came across the grass. Sam came up behind him. The three of them stood around Harry for a long moment in the long grass of the graveyard, with the cauldron behind them and Pettigrew, who had not yet been dealt with but who Sam had restrained 2 minutes earlier by the simple expedient of shooting him in the leg, sniveling in the grass. "What now?" said Steve. The man considered the question. The man had been considering this question for 6 weeks. He had decided in the previous Friday evening's revision of his contingencies that the answer was not the ministry. The ministry, the man had concluded, was a thing he did not trust. He had decided that the answer was not the order, either, although the order under Dumbledore's direction was, the man considered, more nearly trustworthy. He had decided that the answer was the smallest possible answer. He had decided that the small was simpler than the large. "We go home," said the man. "Where's home?" said Sam. "Brooklyn," said the man. He had not said the word in 50 years. It came out this time with the rest of him. "I am taking him to Brooklyn." Steve, who had been waiting some weeks for the man to say this, said only, "All right." They took Cedric the body, who they had retrieved from his small piece of dead ground unharmed, and put him in a sitting position against the headstone for the ministry to find. They took Pettigrew, who they trussed with Sam's spare zip ties and laid in the grass beside Cedric. They took the broken figure that had been Voldemort, and they did not in the end take it. The man had decided that the wraith's body was a thing the ministry should find in its open, undead state, with the broken wand around it, so that the question of whether the thing was dead would be one the wizarding world could answer for itself without his testimony. They left a small note on the cauldron in Bucky's careful handwriting, addressed to Dumbledore, that contained a single sentence: "He is dead. The Death Eaters in the grass are the proof. Yours, JBB." They left the graveyard with Harry between Steve and Sam, and the man at the rear with the metal hand on Harry's shoulder. They took the cup the way Cedric had taken it. The cup, when it had been brought back to the maze by Cedric, had been returned to its plinth by Dumbledore so that it could be used as the portkey for the rescue operation. The cup, after the operation, was, by the man's prior arrangement with Dumbledore, preset to return its travelers not to Hogwarts, but to a small empty apparition station in Edinburgh, from which the man had prearranged onward transit through 3 further points, to a particular brownstone on a quiet street in Brooklyn. The brownstone had been bought in Steve's name in 1947 and held in a series of nested trusts since, and had been waiting 50 years for someone to live in it. The cup fired. They went. The brownstone was on a quiet street in Brooklyn lined with old plane trees. It had 3 floors and a basement and a small garden in the back with a magnolia. The interior had been kept up by a series of caretakers paid out of the trust. The kitchen had a window that looked east over the rooftops, and the morning light in late June came through that window at 6 in a thick slanted bar. Harry, on the first morning, woke in a room on the 2nd floor that had been Steve's room in 1932 and was now, by general agreement, Harry's. He came down the stairs in his pajamas at 6:30. He found Bucky in the kitchen, reading the New York Times. The paper was the late June edition. Bucky was on the 2nd section. He was, in the small, careful way he had developed across the past 7 years, drinking coffee. There was a 2nd cup on the counter. He pushed it toward Harry as Harry came in. The cup contained tea. He had brewed it 5 minutes before. "Morning, M-A-L-Y-N-Y-K-I-A-Kratkoi," said Bucky. The word came out without thinking. He had used it less and less over the years, but in the kitchen in Brooklyn on the first morning after the long 50 years, it came out anyway. "Morning," said Harry. Steve, who had been in the back garden looking at the magnolia, came in through the screen door with a small basket of cherries from the tree at the bottom of the garden. The cherries were the early Bing variety. He set them on the counter. He turned to the stove. He put on water for coffee. Sam, who had stayed up late the previous night talking with Bucky on the back stoop, came down the stairs at 7. He came down with the easy, unhurried gait of a man who had decided that he had a great deal of work to do for the next several years, and that the work would begin properly after breakfast. They ate breakfast at the kitchen table. There were 4 chairs. There was butter on the table, and there were the cherries, and there was a loaf of bread Sam had bought from a Polish bakery on the corner. The bread was good. The cherries were better. Bucky read aloud, at one point, a paragraph from the Times about a politician in Washington Harry had not heard of. Harry, who was developing a politely informed interest in American politics, listened with the same evaluative attention he gave to everything. Steve drank his coffee. The kitchen was sunny. The window was open to the street. Somewhere a child was riding a bicycle past the brownstone. A magnolia petal blew across the back garden and laid itself, with no particular intent, on the back stoop. The man with the metal arm, who had been, by then, James Buchanan Barnes of Brooklyn for some weeks and would never be anything else again, looked at his son across the table. The son was 14 years old, with a faded scar on his forehead and dark hair. He had cut himself in a kitchen mirror that morning, and he was eating bread and cherries with the steady, careful pleasure of a boy who had been told the previous night by his father that he was now home. The father did not say anything. He did not need to. He folded the paper. He set it on the table. He picked up his cup of coffee. He drank. Outside, in the long summer light, the day began. The order of the Phoenix would, in the months to come, untangle the rest. There were Death Eaters to be arrested. There were ministers to be replaced. There was, in time, a small reorganization of the entire wizarding apparatus of Britain, which would take some years and would be carried out, with the steady patience of 2 old men, by Dumbledore and McGonagall. The brownstone in Brooklyn would, throughout, receive a great deal of mail. The mail would be answered where it was answered by Steve, who took on the correspondence because he was good at the slower work and because Bucky had asked. Harry would, in September, attend the public day school in his neighborhood under a name that was nearly his own, and would in the afternoons receive private instruction from a wizard whom Sam had located in Manhattan and whom Hermione, by letter from London, had vetted. He would go back to Hogwarts in the autumn of 1996 for his 5th year, and in the years that followed, but he would always come home, on holidays and at the end of each term, to the brownstone in Brooklyn. He would, in time, become a man who lived in 2 cities and 1 country and several languages. He would, in the manner of his upbringing, do this gracefully. In the kitchen on the first morning, however, none of that had yet happened. There was only the table, and the cherries, and the Times, and the smell of coffee, and the small, steady sound of a boy and his father and their 2 oldest friends eating breakfast in the long, quiet summer light. The father set his cup down. The son took another cherry from the bowl. The plane trees moved in the small, soft breeze outside the window. The war was over. It had ended in the small, grass-tasting way some wars do, in vibranium and silence. In the days after the graveyard, the brownstone settled into a small daily rhythm that none of its 4 residents would have predicted in advance, and all 4 of them, individually, came to depend on within a week. Bucky cooked breakfast. Steve cooked dinner. Sam managed the household correspondence and, increasingly, the household. Harry, who had been raised by a man who considered cleanliness a tactical instrument, swept the kitchen each evening before bed and washed the dishes from supper with the kind of focused, steady attention he had once given to disassembling the Makarov. There were letters, in those first weeks, from London. Hermione wrote 3 times. Ron wrote once and signed off twice. McGonagall wrote, in her careful even hand, to confirm that Harry's place at Hogwarts remained his whenever he chose to take it back up. Dumbledore wrote, in a longer letter, to thank the man with the metal arm formally for his service to the school, to apologize for the events of the third task, and to inform the man that the impostor calling himself Moody had been identified, in the days after the graveyard, as Barty Crouch Jr., that the real Mad-Eye Moody had been recovered alive from a trunk in the impostor's office, and that the ministry was, as predicted, in the process of falling apart. The man read the letter. He read the postscript which said I am proud of him and which had not been written, the man understood, about Harry. He folded the letter. He put it in the desk drawer in the room he had taken on the 3rd floor. He wrote no reply. There was nothing, he had decided, that required one. In the small library off the parlor on the 3rd evening, Harry sat with Sam and learned, on Sam's old travel guitar, the 2nd blues progression he had been promised back in March. He played the progression for 15 minutes, with Sam beside him on a footstool and Steve in the armchair reading and Bucky in the doorway listening. He played it badly the first 3 times. He played it acceptably the 4th. The 5th time, with no warning, the progression resolved into a small thing that was very nearly music. Bucky, in the doorway, said nothing. He had not, in his catalogue of internal lists, ever made a list called Teach Him to Play. He added it now. He marked it, almost immediately, as begun. That night Harry slept the way he had slept on his first night in Prague at the age of 4, which was without any expectation of being woken, in a room with a door that was not bolted, in a house whose 3 other residents had each, separately and silently, made plans to take a continent apart to keep him alive. The plans were not necessary. The house was quiet. Outside on the quiet street, the plane trees moved in the warm wind. A car passed at midnight and did not slow. An owl from somewhere east called twice and was answered. The summer continued. Chapter 6 End.